Chapter 2909. Of course, this was all in the past. The current Luo Fan was already different from before. It could be said that his mystic arts were improving at every moment. With every passing moment, his understanding of cultivation and his understanding of the combination of dimensions and planes was constantly deepening. Although this strengthening still couldn't allow him to break through the resonance of the world's will and cause damage to the world's will again, at the very least, he had enough confidence. At the very least, he had enough confidence in facing the incarnation of the world's will before him. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and the phantoms of mirrors appeared out of thin air and surrounded the perceptual mirror. As they rotated around the perceptual mirror, they constantly shrank and approached the perceptual mirror. In the end, they directly collided with the perceptual mirror and completely fused with it. There were hundreds of these mirror phantoms. After they fused with the perceptual mirror, the aura that the mirror itself emitted became increasingly ethereal and mysterious. Immediately afterward, the perceptual mirror once again released an indescribable brilliance that spread out in all directions. The brilliance directly penetrated the brilliance released by the surrounding vortex and directly entered the vortex. Although it was all brilliance, the brilliance released by the vortex instantly dimmed when it was penetrated by the mirror's brilliance. Soon after, it completely collapsed and turned into endless light spots that disappeared without a trace. It seemed that some indescribable existence that belonged to the light released by the vortex had been erased at this moment. At this moment, the vortex began to tremble violently. All sorts of indescribable lights and shadows appeared in the center of the vortex. As these lights and shadows appeared, the vortex seemed to begin some kind of indescribable transition, and its essence seemed to be undergoing an indescribable transformation. Under this transformation, the light and shadows released by the mirror were weakened layer by layer. It seemed that many rays of light were constantly being turned into nothingness and continuously weakened, causing the light to actually become dimmer and dimmer. However, in the end, the transformation of the vortex was still not enough. Although the brilliance continued to weaken, in the end, there was still light that penetrated the vortex and directly illuminated the void around the vortex. Under this change, the vortex trembled and gradually collapsed. Not long after, it turned completely invisible, like ordinary smoke, and disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. At this moment, under the brilliance released by Luo Fan's perception mirror, the chaos in the surroundings was gradually smoothed out. By the time everything was wiped out, the surrounding space-time had completely disappeared. This place was like an extremely ordinary sea surface in this world. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan just shook his head slightly and sighed. The fusion is not perfect enough. Although the perceptive mirror had already destroyed the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth, it had also completely destroyed this space-time. However, he was not very satisfied with the process. If his method was perfect, the light wouldn't be weakened at all when it shone on the vortex. Instead, it would rush out from the other direction and easily erase the vortex. However, the final result was that the brilliance released by his perceptive mirror was weakened layer by layer, and in the end, it barely managed to get rid of the vortex. This situation showed that his perceptive mirror's fusion between dimensions and planes had not reached a perfect level. Because it was not perfect enough, it could not support each other, transform each other, and make up for each other. That was why there were flaws, and it was weakened layer by layer. Of course, this obviously also meant that his understanding of dimensions and planes was far from enough. This time, he did not achieve a perfect attack to attack the vortex, which meant that this attack would no longer be effective against the will of the heavens and earth the next time. The will of the heavens and earth was ultimately the will of the heavens and earth. The reason why he had easily dealt with it before was because he was not familiar with this attack. To be honest, this kind of attack wasn't too high in terms of level. As long as the will of the heavens and earth was familiar with one of the attacks, unless the attack was flawless, perfect, and flawless, the attack would definitely be full of flaws in the hands of the will of the heavens and earth and would no longer be effective. It was just like the method he used to completely liberate the region that spanned billions of light years. After that, wasn't it no longer effective against the will of the heavens and earth? In fact, it was not only that method that was ineffective, but similar methods could no longer be effective against the spacetime. From a certain point of view, the fact that Luo Fan could still use this mirror to get rid of the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth showed that he had made rapid progress in the fusion of dimensions and planes. With a slight thought, he turned to look at the other spacetimes that were brewing. Instantly, he smiled bitterly. There was an indescribable aura in those spacetimes. An aura that was completely targeted at him, or rather, an aura that was completely targeted at his perceptive mirror. Obviously, after the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth was destroyed, the will of the heavens and earth instantly patched up those spacetimes, giving them the ability to resist the perceptive mirror. This situation made Luo Fan feel rather helpless. If he wanted to, he could indeed break through a few more spacetimes and destroy them. There was no doubt that with Luo Fan's ability, he would definitely be able to come up with a few new methods to deal with the spacetimes in a short period of time. But what was the point of that? After all, the number of spacetimes was calculated in trillions or even trillions. Not to mention a few spacetimes, even if tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of spacetimes were destroyed, so what? Compared to the overall number of spacetimes, it was still insignificant. On the contrary, coming up with some new methods gave the will of the heavens and earth a chance to familiarize itself with his methods. It even gave the will of the heavens and earth a chance to analyze his thoughts. Compared to destroying the insignificant spacetime, his information, his train of thought, and his inspiration were obviously more important. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan no longer intended to take the risk and continue. Then let me see what methods you have. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he turned around and headed towards the wider world behind this spacetime. He naturally would not continue to stay in these spacetimes, let alone at the border of the area. There was an incarnation that controlled the three-legged cauldron and could release endless suppressive power to defend everything there. In contrast, the most important task of his incarnation with the perceptive mirror was obviously to see this world, observe it, and study it. Just as this incarnation headed towards the wider world, the incarnation that controlled the three-legged cauldron did not stay still. At this moment, this incarnation sent out wave after wave of power, which began to open up the corresponding spacetimes in the area outside. Although he wanted to see what the purpose of creating these spacetimes was and what the will of the heavens and earth intended to achieve with the races in those spacetimes. However, this did not prevent him from creating some obstacles. Creating corresponding spacetimes was obviously a matter of course for him. Of course, he did not completely replicate the appearance of the spacetime outside. Instead, he vaguely arranged these spacetimes in a subtle way, allowing them to vaguely build a huge formation. It was a formation that could completely envelop the entire border. This formation's magical effect was not obvious, and no one knew what it was used for. However, at this moment, it was like a sharp sword suspended in midair, making one feel as if there was a fishbone stuck in one's throat. With Luo Fan's ability, it would naturally be extremely difficult for him to open up a perfect world. However, if he were to open up an ordinary world, it would be as simple as eating and drinking. Moreover, what he was opening up now was only a piece of spacetime that was dependent on the outside world. This kind of thing was even easier for him. In just a few dozen breaths, an unknown number of trillions of spacetimes that corresponded to the outside spacetime had already been rapidly formed. Of course, Luo Fan was ultimately not the will of the heavens and earth, and he did not have such a huge body. Therefore, although these spacetimes had been formed, the things within them, the laws within them, and the races within them were still in the process of brewing. It would obviously take quite a long time for them to truly be completed and truly born. However, this did not affect the outside world much. Although it needed to be attached to the outside world, the spacetime itself already contained time and space. With Luo Fan's ability, it was not a problem at all to distort the flow of time in those spacetimes. Even if the creatures and races in those spacetimes needed a long time to brew, they would still be able to make it in time in the end. It's much livelier. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan leisurely sighed. Currently, the situation in this world had clearly undergone a tremendous change compared to before. The original emptiness and lifeless atmosphere could no longer be seen. Whether it was this area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the world, or the areas that were still under the shackles of the will of the world in the outside world, they seemed to be filled with vitality and were extraordinarily lively. Of course, all of this was clearly the situation in this area that was close to the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the world. The areas further out were actually still lifeless. At least, that was the case in the eyes of Luo Fan's clone. Along the way, Luo Fan also saw many of the founders that he had saved. However, he had no intention of going up to greet those founders. After all, he had already severed all ties with them. Now that he did not go up to look at them in the mirror, it could already be considered that he still cherished the old times. At the same time that Luo Fan saw them, the heaven and earth pioneers naturally saw him too. However, just like Luo Fan, they did not go up to greet him at all. The friendlier ones only glanced at Luo Fan with complicated gazes. Most of them were expressionless, as if they did not notice Luo Fan at all. They treated him like air. Luo Fan naturally did not care about such a development at all. He only studied this world while heading further away. Although he did not pay much attention to the world founders, he had seen a lot along the way, so he naturally knew what they were doing. Those founders were doing what Luo Fan had previously led them to do, which was to liberate more founders. However, for those liberated world founders, their choice was not the same as Luo Fan's. They did not persuade those world founders to leave with them. Instead, after they were liberated, they left behind some contact information and agreed to help each other. On the other hand, the will of the heavens and the earth completely ignored them and the creators of the world they liberated. It didn't follow Luo Fan like it did back then, and it didn't show any signs of wanting to completely erase everything Luo Fan had done. Due to the efforts of those founders, this world was clearly becoming more and more lively and full of life. Luo Fan took a quick look and no longer paid attention to the world's founders. Although he was not in a hurry, he did not waste too much time either. He kept heading out and gradually, the surroundings became more and more empty and lifeless. Initially, they were still able to see some world founders, but unknowingly, the number of world founders was decreasing. In the end, he could no longer see them. The reason for this was that Luo Fan's range of activity had already surpassed the range of all the founders that he had seen before. Of course, although the founders could no longer be seen, the surroundings were not completely lifeless. In fact, although the creator of the world no longer existed, the various derivatives that the world had absorbed from the simulated primal chaos still spread out in an almost random manner. Even Luo Fan could not imagine how many worlds there were in the simulated primal chaos. Chapter 29:10. Even in a place that was extremely far away from Luo Fan's world of laws, there were still countless derivatives existing. These derivatives seemed to have been born at the same time as the world and were randomly distributed all over this world. At least based on what Luo Fan had seen and heard about this world, there was no place where the derivatives were more concentrated than other places. At the same time, there was not a single location where the derivatives were more sparse than the rest of the locations. Although the distribution of the derivatives was not completely uniform, it was more or less uniform. Because of this, even though it had far exceeded the range of activity of the creator of the world, The surrounding situation was still similar to the surroundings of the world of laws. It was still not monotonous. This side of the world was simply too big. Even if Luo Fan could use various subtle methods to find the direction of the core, it was not an easy task to actually get there. Even if space-time was not an obstacle to him, it was still the same. This process of continuous advancement continued for several years. When he reached the boundary of the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth, the space-time derived from the will of heaven and earth had truly taken shape, and the space-time corresponding to it had also been perfected. Only then did he truly sense the location of the core of the world. The core of the world was an extremely mysterious concept. In reality, it was a concept that existed within space-time, but it was also a concept that exceeded space-time. If one were to insist that it was inside space-time and belonged to a certain key node in this world, it would make sense. However, if one really treated it as that node, it would be a huge mistake. It was like a metaphysical existence. If one wanted to find it, one could only find the corresponding location. However, one could not truly find it just by finding the corresponding location. At this moment, what Luo Fan came into contact with was that node. This node was faintly discernible, illusory, yet real at the same time. It seemed to be a very ordinary location in this world. It also seemed to be the most important place in this world. There seemed to be nothing special about it, but it also seemed to be closely related to everything in this world. This was the core of the world. Or rather, it was the place where the core and the normal spacetime of this world intersected. It was the place of reflection. Why didn't that power choose this place? Why did it choose the perfect world? Looking at this core, the doubts that had accumulated in Luo Fan's heart for a long time surfaced once again. No matter how much he opposed the will of the world, he had to admit that this world was extremely great. Compared to this world, even a perfect world was nothing. It could only be considered insignificant. Under such circumstances, if the power related to the true divine wanted to use the core of a world as its residence, it would obviously choose the world core in front of them as compared to a perfect world core. However, it was obvious that this was all in Luo Fan's imagination. The power related to the true divine simply didn't care about this world. It didn't care about the core at all. Between the perfect world and this world that was many times greater than the perfect world, it actually chose the perfect world. No matter how one looked at it, it was an incomprehensible matter. The reason this had happened was obviously because there was something at the core of this world that Luo Fan was unaware of. Perhaps it was a loophole, perhaps it was a weakness, or perhaps it was simply not comfortable enough. However, the answer to all this would perhaps be revealed very soon. After all, the core of the world was already in front of him. It was just waiting for him to step into it. Even though the derivatives absorbed from the world were evenly distributed throughout this world, it was impossible for them to survive. However, almost was only almost. It was impossible to be truly evenly distributed. At least, the number of derivatives around this node, which was the core of the world, was several times more than the other areas with the highest concentration of derivative. As long as one observed carefully, they would realize that this place was definitely not ordinary. Moreover, the characteristics of the many derivatives were rather unique. They seemed to be resonating with each other and faintly gathered into a strange whole. It was not a formation, not a talisman, not a divine ability, not a magic art, and definitely not some inexplicable talisman or something like that. That was simply a whole that resonated with each other. This whole was faintly discernible, and its characteristics were quite similar to the core of the world. Since he was already here, Luo Fan naturally could not retreat so easily. At this moment, with just a thought, the perception mirror had already appeared in front of him. With a slight shake, countless specks of light were released from the mirror and continuously condensed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a path of light. Starting from the mirror, it extended all the way to the center of the derivatives, the node that corresponded to the core of the world. The moment this path of light was formed, the many derivatives trembled slightly. Suddenly, an inexplicable power was born out of thin air and began to corrode the path of light. In the blink of an eye, the path of light had already become mottled. Not long after, it had already broken into countless pieces. All the originally condensed light instantly collapsed and turned into endless specks of light. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luofan's face. Looks like there are indeed many arrangements. At this moment, he vaguely understood why the power related to the true divine did not care about this core. It was like a disposable bag. After it had already been filled with trash, who would pour out the trash and put it on their heads? To the power related to the true divine, everything in the simulated chaotic state, even if it was created by the existence that simulated the chaotic state's will, was almost a type of trash. Under such circumstances, the core that was occupied by the arrangements of the world's will was obviously equivalent to a bag that had already been filled with trash. Even to the power related to the true divine, it was an extremely simple task to empty the bag and then clean it. However, it was very obvious that even if everything returned to its original state, the disgust in its heart would definitely not disappear. Although the power related to the true divine was not a real living being, this disgust should still exist, of course. This was only a guess formed from the little bit of information that had been gathered in front of him. As for the specifics, whether it was what he thought it was would depend on whether the arrangements in the core really existed. The whole body formed by the many derivatives was like a living creature. Although it did not have a body and did not have a consciousness, it had some sort of instinctive reaction ability. It had an unimaginable repelling effect on any power or matter that invaded it. With a slight thought, Luofan raised his hand and grabbed the perceptive mirror in front of him. Countless shadows flashed past, and the mirror seemed to have become even more simple and unadorned in an instant. However, corresponding to this change, the aura that the mirror itself emitted became even more powerful. In fact, it had even caused an indescribable distortion in the surrounding space-time, and one could even faintly see traces of cracks appearing in the distortion. This was only caused by the existence of the mirror itself. From this, one could imagine how unimaginable the power of the mirror would be if it was truly activated. After the mirror developed such a change, Luofan did not hesitate. With a slight thought, a monster suddenly rushed out of the mirror. This monster looked like a human, but its body was extremely strange. Its arms were extremely long, and if it were to really relax, it would probably drag dozens of meters in front and behind it. On the other hand, its body was thin and long. Its legs were extremely thick, but they were relatively short. At least, compared to its arms, they were extremely short. As for its facial features, they were extremely strange. Its cheeks were densely packed with eyes, and when they blinked slightly, it would make one dizzy. On the other hand, its mouth was extremely small, as if it was just a small hole. One could not even see if there were teeth inside. Its ears were like tentacles, constantly swaying in the wind on both sides of its head. The entire appearance clearly did not conform to the standards of the average person. After this monster left the mirror, its figure kept changing. It suddenly disappeared, then reappeared, and then completely lost its presence. Then, it would suddenly have an unimaginable presence. Sometimes, it was like the gathering of rules and karma, and sometimes, it was like an illusory and formless thing. At this moment, it violently crashed into the body formed by the many derivatives in front of it. The whole body was instantly activated, and an unknown amount of indescribable power continuously gathered in one spot, wanting to annihilate the monster. However, this monster kept changing in the process. In a short while, it had already transformed into the state where the power that was gathering in the surroundings had directly merged with the power, and easily made its way to the center, where the node corresponding to the core of the world was located. The whole made up of countless derivatives seemed to have been enraged at this moment. It released all sorts of indescribable power in a frenzy. Through the circulation within the whole made up of derivatives, it turned into a terrifying power that was getting stronger and stronger. It quickly crushed towards the monster. At this moment, time and space, rules and laws, matter, energy, karma, fate, and everything else was completely separated. With this core as the center, it formed an independent space and time, or rather, an independent world, an independent heaven and earth. Although this core area was only a node, in reality, the area it occupied was rather large. In fact, one would need to calculate it in light years to clearly describe its area. In the eyes of an ordinary cultivator, such a vast area was already unimaginably vast. Not to mention a single world, even thousands of worlds would be easily separated. An indescribable malice rose into the sky. Even though it seemed to be separated from the whole body by a dimension and space, Luo Fan could still clearly feel this unimaginably terrifying malice. Under this malice, everything in the world seemed to be stained with some kind of dusky color, as if all the beauty had been completely devoured. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Is that all? Looks like this isn't an arrangement that can be updated at any time, he thought to himself. In the past, this method might have been a little troublesome if he had not comprehended the method of combining dimensions and planes. However, now that he had comprehended this method of combining dimensions and planes, and had even developed this method to a rather profound level over the years, this kind of arrangement was just a joke. At this moment, he did not even need to do anything. With just a slight thought, the monster reflected by the perceptual mirror suddenly opened its mouth, causing the originally small mouth to suddenly expand to a size that was almost larger than its entire body. Then, an unimaginable suction force appeared above the mouth, and the endless malice outside was like 100 rivers flowing into the sea, crazily pouring into the huge mouth, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. When all the malice that was enough to erase all the beauty in the surroundings disappeared, the power released by the whole body of derivatives was like a fortress on the beach, collapsing into nothingness in the blink of an eye. At this moment, the monster had already returned to its original appearance. It looked as if nothing had happened, and it was still standing there quietly like before. Without malice, its power and power naturally don't know where to vent, Luo Fan thought to himself. Without any hesitation, he lifted his foot and walked toward the core. Every single derivative was formed by a part of the world, and the power, and essence contained within each derivative was not something that ordinary objects and powers could compare to. If they really erupted and scrupulously, destroying heaven and earth would be a piece of cake. When they were combined, the effect produced was even more earth-shattering. If all the power of this whole body was used on a creator of the world, even if the creator of the world was thousands of times more powerful than the creator of the world, there was no reason for him to survive. Chapter 29:11. It was like a man whose organs were crippled. Although he longed for something in his heart, he could not awaken that organ no matter how hard he tried. At this time, the whole body formed by these derivatives was like that. The malice that was being swallowed was not just the malice that was shown on the surface. Even the mechanism that produced the malice and the source of the malice had been swallowed by the monster. Therefore, after being swallowed by the monster, the whole body had completely lost the ability to produce malice, and had completely lost the ability to attack. Even if the whole body instinctively knew that it could gather endless power to completely obliterate Luo Fan, it was unable to do so. No matter how hard it tried, it was unable to condense the endless power that originally existed in its body onto its target. At this time, although there was endless power slightly surging in the surroundings, and infinite power was gathering with all its might, Luo Fan was like a breeze, easily crossing a long distance. In a short while, He had already arrived next to the monster from the perception mirror. He stood directly at the connection between the core of the world and the surface spacetime. The moment he stood there, he suddenly felt like he had become the center of the entire world. It was as if the entire world was revolving around him, and everything in the world was revolving around him. This feeling made him even more certain that the point in front of him was the core of the world. Only as the core of the world, a position alone could bring him such an indescribable feeling. Of course, Luo Fan would not indulge in this inexplicable feeling. Very soon, he suppressed that feeling and directly controlled the monster that was extremely quiet beside him to charge upward. It directly broke into an extremely vast spacetime. This spacetime was so huge that it almost exceeded all of Luo Fan's imagination. At a glance, it was probably not much smaller than the residence of the world's will. At this time, there were many strange figures moving in an indescribable way in this spacetime. These figures all had different appearances from Luo Fan's aesthetic standard. However, every single figure was able to emit a perfect charm, causing one to feel that even such a strange figure possessed an unimaginable charm. This situation could only happen in the image of a certain world's born Taoism aptitude. At this moment, in this world, in the core spacetime of this world, countless figures appeared. Clearly, there was no need to guess what they were. These were definitely the countless founders of the world. Perhaps this was not their actual bodies, but their appearance was definitely their appearance. At this time, the monster that Luo Fan had sent out with the help of the perception mirror was instantly subjected to endless terrifying pressure after entering this spacetime. In just an instant, it only had time to transmit what Luo Fan had sensed before it completely collapsed under the terrifying crushing power and disappeared without a trace. That kind of pressure was so terrifying that even if that monster was a strange state formed by Luo Fan's strange combination of many layers and dimensions, which was enough to destroy all kinds of invisible and intangible sources of anything, it still couldn't resist this kind of terrifying pressure that had suddenly appeared. During the entire process of being suppressed, it did not show any ability to resist at all. At this time, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan slightly frowned. This change was somewhat similar to what he had previously guessed, but also somewhat different. There seemed to be arrangements inside, and there were all kinds of arrangements that were completely rubbish to the power related to the true divine. However, the mysteriousness of this arrangement was still beyond his imagination. This sudden mysterious pressure was like the fundamental rejection of spacetime, and also like the fundamental rejection of the entire world. And what was the purpose of gathering so many figures related to the world's founders? What exactly do you want to do? At this time, Luo Fan could not help but mutter. All of this was obviously created by the world's will. And obviously, the world's will could not have created all of this without a purpose. It must have its own thoughts and goals for doing this. This kind of thoughts and goals was definitely extremely obscure, and it must be of great importance. Perhaps in the end, it might even set off an extremely terrifying disaster for Luo Fan. It was not Luo Fan's wishful thinking that this arrangement might be targeted at him. Instead, it was completely deduced from the fundamental purpose of the world's will. After all, the world's will had already completely understood the meaning of its existence. It knew that its existence was completely because the state of chaos was created to test Luo Fan. And previously, it even expressed that even if it wanted to continue to delay, there was no more time, and there was no other way. Since that was the case, all the situation, all the changes, and all the means it had created were obviously targeted at Luo Fan. The core of the world in front of him was naturally the same. At this time, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The perception mirror in his hand condensed slightly again, and the other figure leaped out. This figure was not in the shape of a monster, but in the shape of a divine dragon. After appearing, the divine dragon twisted its body slightly, and its figure easily passed through the barrier of spacetime, directly stepping into the spacetime that was the core of the world. After stepping into it, there was naturally an incredible pressure on the divine dragon. In that instant, as the divine dragon twisted slightly, its body was extremely agile as it dispelled the incredible pressure layer by layer. Countless terrifying forces constantly collided around its body, creating a terrifying impact that shook the heavens and the earth. Circle after circle, it spread in all directions like ripples. This terrifying movement affected an extremely large area. At the beginning, it had already affected the surrounding spacetime within dozens of light-years. And this was just the beginning. As time passed, as the divine dragon continued to twist and dispel the surrounding pressure, the area of influence continued to expand at an unimaginable speed. After a short while, its range of influence had unknowingly expanded to an area of trillions of light-years. In this area that was ravaged by the shock waves, there were naturally countless figures that represented the world's founders. At this time, these figures were stirred by the fluctuations, and as if they were activated, their gazes began to gather in the direction of the divine dragon from all directions, like searchlights focused on the divine dragon. Waves of indescribable agility began to gradually appear in these originally muddle-headed, puppet-like figures. With this agility, the entire spacetime seemed to be gradually activated. Vaguely, there was a light that gradually appeared in the void above the void. At first, this light only covered the spacetime within trillions of light-years, and its brightness was only average. At most, it was the intensity of normal sunlight in an ordinary world. However, as time passed, as more and more figures focused their gazes on the divine dragon, the light also began to continuously gather and compress. Unknowingly, it had already directly gathered in the location of the divine dragon from its original state of covering trillions of light-years, and the brightness had directly increased by trillions of times. It could be said that if an ordinary cultivator faced such a light, they would definitely die. Even if there was no temperature, just the light itself had already reached an unimaginable level of lethality after being condensed to this extent. Any tangible or intangible body would probably be completely annihilated by this light. At that time, what would be destroyed by the light would not only be the body of flesh and blood, but also the soul, divine soul, mind, willpower, life origin, and the essence of life. Even a trace of existence would be completely destroyed. However, it was obvious that the divine dragon was not an ordinary cultivator. In fact, it was not even a cultivator. It was only a special phenomenon constructed by Luo Fan's perceptual mirror by combining dimensions with many other dimensions in an indescribably mysterious way. Although it looked like a divine dragon and a living being, in fact, all of this was just the appearance of that phenomenon. It wasn't even a living creature. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for it to be directly destroyed by the light. Even if it appeared here without any resistance, it was very likely that the divine dragon still had a lot of remnants when the light gathered to this extent. Perhaps it was only slightly injured. Moreover, what was the divine dragon doing at this moment? At this moment, the divine dragon was using the strongest dispersal method to dispel the terrifying pressure of this space-time. Due to this method, any power targeted at the divine dragon would be dispelled by the divine dragon, including the light that could cause damage to the divine dragon itself. At this moment, the light gathered on the divine dragon's body, but it seemed as if it had smashed into a strange crystal divine dragon. All sorts of indescribable diffraction occurred. As the light poured in, it was unknown how many billions of rays of light were emitted from its body and transmitted in all directions, directly smashing into the endless terrifying pressure in the surroundings. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, the original silence was finally completely broken. Terrifying roars were constantly emitted from the divine dragon's body. Wave after wave of sound waves swept the surroundings like monstrous waves. Even though the light and the pressure targeted at the divine dragon leaked out, The figures related to the world's founders did not care at all. No matter how the power and light swept past, there was no reaction. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the pressure and light did not exist at all. However, the figures were not so calm in the face of the sudden and terrifying sound waves. Many figures were swept away in all directions like fallen leaves swept by the waves. Some figures even completely collapsed in the sound waves and disintegrated into powder, scattering and disappearing into the void along with the sound waves in the blink of an eye. This area was emptied. Moreover, the empty area continued to expand, becoming wider and wider. At this moment, the void froze and all changes stopped in an instant. It was as if time had completely stopped at this moment. Be it the sound waves, the light, or the terrifying pressure targeted at the divine dragon, all of them were completely frozen at this moment. Everything in the entire spacetime seemed to have become a fixed scene in a painting. Faced with this situation, the snake dragon wriggled slightly at this moment and had already broken free from the center of being targeted. It began to fly around and dive into the ground to observe everything around it. Everything was focused on Luo Fan, so that Luo Fan could clearly sense everything it was sensing. At this moment, the space-time suddenly began to shake violently. Due to this shaking, cracks began to appear in the originally stagnant space-time. These cracks covered all the areas of the stagnant spacetime. They were densely packed, as if the entire area was completely constructed by the endless fragments. Immediately after, everything collapsed completely. All the fragments scattered and turned into endless powder that began to gradually gather and condense into a huge palm. It was a terrifying palm that looked similar to Luo Fan's palm but was billions of times larger than Luo Fan's palm. After this palm was formed, it directly grabbed the divine dragon, and with a slight tremble, it completely destroyed the divine dragon. As the divine dragon was destroyed, everything in front of Luo Fan's eyes turned black. The various scenes and senses that were transmitted from the divine dragon had completely disappeared without a trace. This kind of attack. At this moment, Luo Fan had a look of shock on his face. This kind of attack was beyond his imagination. Even though his own methods had been destroyed by this attack, he still couldn't figure out the principle behind this attack, let alone how to resist it. Chapter 29:12. Immediately after, an invisible palm emerged from the void and pressed down on him at a seemingly slow speed. The moment the invisible palm appeared, the sense of crisis skyrocketed by thousands of times. It even felt like this sense of crisis alone was enough to make most cultivators lose control of themselves. This was the palm that had wiped out the divine dragon previously. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. As for why this palm had appeared, he instantly understood the reason. This palm was completely based on the connection between the divine dragon and Luo Fan. It directly broke through space and time and found the source of Luo Fan's body from the tail end. At this moment, it was planning to directly attack Luo Fan's body. At this moment, Luo Fan only shook the mirror in his hand slightly, and countless phantoms appeared on the mirror. Each of them soared into the sky and rushed towards the invisible palm. In the blink of an eye, they collided with the palm. These phantoms were naturally some kind of product of the combination of the dimensions and planes that the mirror could control. Different phantoms meant different ways of combining. Normally, even if the opposing force could resist a certain number of phantoms, which was to say the combination of a certain dimension and plane, it could not resist all the phantoms. However, at this moment, when the numerous phantoms fiercely collided with the invisible palm above, it was like a breeze colliding with a wall. Not even a ripple was stirred up, and it had already been forcefully crushed by the invisible palm. It did not even have the ability to slow down the invisible palm. The palm was still the same as before, which seemed slow but was actually fast as it continuously pressed down, continuously shortening the distance between it and Luo Fan. What a guy! Luo Fan could not help but be secretly amazed. However, he clearly could not give up just like that. With a slight thought, his own combination of dimensions and planes continuously appeared in his mind. All kinds of wisdom and inspiration were continuously born in his heart. During this process, the perception mirror in his hand also produced corresponding changes, and all kinds of inexplicable images continuously appeared in the mirror. As the images on the mirror changed, the surrounding dimensions were continuously divided. The plane of reality, which originally had no dimensions, was already divided into tens of thousands of dimensions in the blink of an eye. With the help of the planes, there was no longer a need to use the power of the light of heaven and earth to divide the dimensions. The planes themselves were existences that corresponded to the plane of reality. Although there were so many planes, in fact, each plane itself was as vast and powerful as the plane of reality. Under such circumstances, the potential that the light of heaven and earth possessed was obviously not something that the light of heaven and earth could compare to. Therefore, as long as the method of using the light of heaven and earth could do something, other planes could also do it. It was the same for the method of dividing the plane of reality into dimensions. Moreover, compared to what the light of heaven and earth could do, it was actually easier to use other planes to divide the plane of reality. After all, the division of dimensions itself was similar to the structure of the planes in a certain way. In other words, there was a natural, indescribable connection between the two. This connection made the communication of power and power between the two naturally extremely smooth. In this way, it was obviously much easier to use the power of other planes to strengthen the ability of dividing the dimensions than to use the power of that plane to do other things. At this moment, the role that Luo Fan took on was equivalent to a catalyst. He was only equivalent to strengthening and expanding the natural connection between the other planes and the dimensions. After that, no matter how the plane strengthened the ability of dividing the dimensions, or how it improved the effects of dividing the dimensions, this was just the result of the power of the various planes being released. Thousands of planes and dimensions were divided. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to be in thousands of them at the same time. Among them, in each dimension, he was only facing 1/10,000th of the enemy. Under his method of division, everything around him seemed to have become much thinner. Even the whole body formed by the numerous derivatives around him had been divided into thousands of different parts. Some of them even directly exposed their weakest points in front of Luo Fan. As long as he was willing, he could easily destroy those weak points and completely destroy the whole body of the derivatives. This method seemed to be much more violent than before, when he used the multiple structures of dimensions and planes to devour and destroy the whole body of malice. In terms of technique, it seemed to have regressed. However, in reality, compared to before, the effect of this method against the enemy was many times stronger. If this kind of violent method was just a simple combination of one or two planes and dimensions, it naturally could not be used at all. However, when the number of derivatives increased to thousands, the situation was obviously completely different. Once it reached a certain scale, this originally violent and even crude method of attack instantly became like a tidal wave, becoming unstoppable. At this moment, Luo Fan was even confident that if he had comprehended this method previously, the will of heaven and earth would not have been able to find a way to get rid of his method so easily. After all, the will of heaven and earth could not really communicate with the other planes. To him, if he wanted to stop the various methods that Luo Fan used with the help of the other planes, he could only use indirect methods to achieve his goal. Otherwise, why would it take Luo Fan every time he used it to think of a way to defend against this method? Since it was an indirect method, it was naturally impossible for the reaction to be very fast. Even the will of heaven and earth would not be able to withstand thousands of attacks at the same time that would originally require a huge amount of effort to block each of them. Moreover, what Luo Fan used now was just the beginning. That level was limitless. In other words, if he wanted to, these thousands of dimensions could definitely be multiplied by thousands of times, or even billions of times. For Luo Fan, what he needed to do to multiply the number of dimensions was to strengthen and expand the connection between more planes and dimensions. He did not need to expend too much effort and energy. After that, how the planes supported the dimensions, how to help the dimensions vent their power, and so on were all matters between the planes and dimensions. Compared to resisting the existence of this kind of division of dimensions, the energy needed to eliminate these attacks would probably double for every additional type of attack. If this continued, the final victor would obviously be Luo Fan. At this time, the thousands of dimensions directly divided the space and time where Luo Fan was, causing the space and time within an unknown number of light-years around him to be divided into thousands of layers. The whole created by the surrounding derivatives was nothing to Luo Fan. After completely destroying its malice, this whole body was no longer a threat to him. At this time, his focus was on the invisible palm that was pressing down on him from above. The sense of danger he sensed from that palm was simply too strong. This sense of danger was so strong that he suspected that if his incarnation was destroyed here, his real body might be implicated and suffer serious damage. Under such circumstances, of course, he could not shift his focus from the palm in front of him to other existences. In the face of this division of dimensions, circles of ripples flashed continuously on the invisible palm. These ripples started from various places and spread to every inch of the giant palm's skin. After they intertwined, it looked so chaotic and ugly, however, this palm managed to block the dimensional division technique. The dimensional division technique, which could split almost anything, was actually ineffective against that palm. It couldn't really cut into the palm, and it couldn't really split the palm into countless dimensions. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. The changes in front of him made him feel a little shocked. It must be known that even if it was the will of heaven and earth, it was only because it was too large and far exceeded the range of his division of dimensions that he was unable to get rid of it in one go. However, the palm in front of him, which was obviously a creation method of the will of heaven and earth, actually had such a defensive ability in the face of this division of dimensions. How could he not be shocked? At this moment, he had countless thoughts about the nature of the palm in front of him. This process seemed to be quite long, but in fact, the entire process happened in less than an instant. If it was an ordinary living being, their reaction speed would not even be able to distinguish this instant. Of course, it was obvious that for Luo Fan, who could treat 100 trillion years as an instant, this instant was enough for him to react in countless ways. It was even enough for him to have some sort of inspiration, and then deduce this inspiration to the extreme, and finally turn it into his own remarkable ability to fight against the enemy. At this moment, even though the defensive ability and offensive ability of the invisible palm were unimaginably powerful and terrifying, Luo Fan did not despair and wait for the palm to press down and erase him. There are ripples, which means that the attack actually has an effect. It's just that the power is too weak, so it has no effect. At this moment, he was extremely clear in his heart. The ripples caused by the division of dimensions were clearly the result of the interaction between the division of dimensions and the invisible palm. The appearance of this result also represented the fact that the division of dimensions had actually caused some sort of damage to the invisible palm. It was just that this damage was nothing compared to the defensive ability of the invisible palm itself, which was why the attack only manifested in the form of ripples. Since this was confirmed, it was obvious that the next thing to do was to naturally strengthen the attack. As long as this kind of attack was continuously strengthened to a certain extent, then these ripples would definitely be strengthened to the point where they could completely split apart the invisible palm. It just so happened that it was not difficult for Luo Fan to strengthen the division of dimensions at this moment. At this moment, he had a thought. The perceptive mirror in his hand trembled slightly, and suddenly expanded by 1,000 times. From the appearance of an ordinary copper mirror, it directly turned into a huge copper mirror that covered the sky. With this change, all sorts of inexplicable shadows suddenly burst out from Luo Fan's body. There was an extremely large number of these shadows, and after they burst out, they directly dissipated into nothingness as if they had never appeared in the first place. At the same time, the number of dimensions that were originally less than 10,000 instantly skyrocketed by 1,000 times. In the blink of an eye, the number had increased from less than 10,000 to nearly 100 million. At this moment, Luo Fan's body could not help but tremble slightly. Even though it was not difficult to expand the connection between a certain level and the dimensions, when the number increased to a certain extent and directly reached the order of nearly 100 million, the accumulation of the subtle pressure was extremely significant. At this time, Luo Fan clearly felt the invisible pressure that was released from the dimension and how strong it was. Under this pressure, it could be said that he completely relied on the material of the incarnation itself to resist the pressure. If it was not for the fact that the incarnation itself was made of a power that was close to that of a true sage, this pressure would have been enough to completely crush his incarnation. After paying such a huge price and withstanding such strong pressure, the effect of this attack was also quite considerable. At this moment, the many ripples on the invisible palm had become so dense that the invisible palm gradually lost its form. Under this terrifying ripple, the invisible palm looked like countless palms trying their best to overlap, but due to some kind of restriction, they could not perfectly overlap in the end. There were some subtle deviations between each other, forming the first overall image. Chapter 29:13. This clearly meant that the dimension-severing technique had truly begun to take effect on the invisible palm. Now, although the invisible palm had yet to be completely divided into countless dimensions, it was only a final push away from being truly divided. In the face of such a situation, was there a need to say more about what to do? At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and the many dimensions constructed by the perceptive mirror trembled at the same time. Every dimension began to rapidly change position amidst the tremors. An indescribable tearing force was born from the countless dimensions in an instant. Along with this tearing force, the invisible palm, which originally had many shadows but was still a complete entity, instantly collapsed. The invisible palm was forcibly divided into hundreds of millions of different plane attributes, and was completely divided by the hundreds of millions of dimensions. It's actually so powerful. If I hadn't divided so many dimensions, I probably wouldn't have been able to do anything to it. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Looking at the plane attributes that belonged to the invisible palm that had been divided by hundreds of millions of dimensions, he completely understood the fact that he had spent so much effort to barely divide the invisible palm with dimensions. That formless palm was simply too mystical. Even though it had been divided into hundreds of millions of plane attributes, the vast majority of them were still extremely tough and powerful. Even though they had been separated, it was still extremely difficult to deal with them. If the individual attributes were already so tenacious and powerful, then when they were combined together, they would be able to protect, support each other. In the end, they would be able to form a complete entity. This went without saying. Of course, this did not mean that the various plane attributes were all that powerful and tough. After all, the invisible palm could not possibly be perfect. This was especially so when it did not specifically target the plane attributes or strengthen the dimensions. Therefore, although the vast majority of the plane attributes were still extremely powerful and tough after being separated, it was ultimately only the vast majority. After all, there was still a small portion of the plane attributes that lost the cover, support of the other plane attributes after being separated. Hence, their fragile nature was truly exposed. Obviously, in the face of Luo Fan's method of division, which was a combination of dimensions and planes, there was no need to mention the numerous weak points. However, a single weakness was enough to be fatal. At this moment, although Luo Fan was lamenting in his heart, His movements did not slow down at all. With just a slight thought, the dimension that enveloped the weakness was instantly annihilated. Along with the attributes of the invisible palm in those dimensions, along with this change, a formless shattering sound spread through the void within a range of who knows how many light years. Along with the shattering sound, the invisible palm finally collapsed. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. However, as those layers of attributes were destroyed, the invisible palm was also completely annihilated. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had an inexplicable expression on his face. He seemed to have come to a sudden realization, but also seemed to have an inexplicable sense of melancholy. At this moment, in the space-time that was the core of the world, countless figures of the world founders started to collapse one after another. In the end, a tenth of the figures of the world founders completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. However, this kind of collapse was only temporary. After they collapsed, the space-time started to vibrate subtly. All sorts of indescribably strange fluctuations started to sweep through the space-time again. Every time a fluctuation swept through, a figure of a world founder would appear. 10 fluctuations would sweep through, and 10 figures of the world founders would appear. 100 fluctuations would mean 100 figures. Just like that, the ripples swept out continuously, and the figures of the world's founders were continuously formed within it. Of course, even so, there were simply too many figures of the world founders that had been lost. Therefore, it was still not easy to make up for all the figures of the world founders that had been lost. At the very least, it would take a long time for the space-time to return to its former state. At this moment, although Luo Fan did not see the changes in the space-time with his own eyes, he could already guess what the changes were based on the aura of the space-time. He did not see that the space-time was trembling, and every time it trembled, its aura seemed to swell and strengthen. It was as if some sort of power was constantly being injected into the space-time, causing it to continuously strengthen. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, the perception mirror disappeared without a trace. Immediately after, he waved his hand, and as the space-time distorted, a door appeared in front of him. Without any hesitation, he directly stepped through the door and entered the space-time that was the core of the world. This time, he did not use any divine ability to sense the space-time. Instead, his avatar personally stepped into it and personally felt the various changes and attacks within the space-time. As his figure passed through the door, it instantly collapsed and disappeared without a trace. This area, which was the intersection point between the world and the core space-time, had completely returned to peace in the blink of an eye. In fact, it was even more peaceful than before Luo Fan had appeared. After all, before Luo Fan had appeared, the many derivatives in the surroundings would occasionally communicate with each other, causing the sea surface, the air, and even space-time to tremble. At this moment, the many derivatives were unprecedentedly calm. Although they were not dead, they did not move as much as before. In this way, this area was naturally rather peaceful. At this moment, Luo Fan had already entered the space-time that was the core of the world. When he arrived, he could clearly feel the fluctuations that appeared in the space-time again. Ordinary people would feel that every fluctuation was the same, and it could even be said that there was no difference. However, in Luo Fan's own perception, each of these fluctuations was unique, and they were completely different from any other fluctuations. Every fluctuation was like a special magnet that attracted a special existence from outside the space-time and gathered it in this space-time. Like this, the continuous undulations represented the continuous gathering of the special existences that were attracted here. It's not the original bodies of the world's founders, but some kind of special mark. Looking at the countless figures around him, and feeling the unique characteristics of the fluctuations, Luo Fan made a judgment in his heart. The figures of the world's founders seemed to be the same as the original founders, but in reality, they were not even living creatures. In comparison, they were more like the divine dragon that Luo Fan had formed with the help of the perceptual mirror. They were more like a phenomenon, a landscape, a special existence that was born naturally and had no physical body. At this moment, an indescribable repulsive force acted on Luo Fan's body, as if it wanted to send him out of this space-time and make it impossible for him to stay in this space-time for a moment longer. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan merely waved his hand casually, and the repulsive force was instantly wiped out. It could no longer affect him. His entire body instantly became relaxed, and the surroundings became calm again. Apart from the ripples that kept appearing, the reason for this was that Luo Fan's wave just now had not only wiped out the repulsive force that was attacking him, but it had also completely wiped out the source of the repulsive force. The repulsive force was produced because Luo Fan was a foreign object in this spacetime. This was because he was a foreign object that was constantly affecting the surroundings, causing the surrounding spacetime to sense him. That was why the repulsive force acted on him and wanted to expel him out of this spacetime. In other words, there were three existences involved in the repulsive force. One of them was naturally Luo Fan. Because Luo Fan was a foreign object in this spacetime, the spacetime would produce a repulsive force to expel him. The second was this spacetime. Even though Luo Fan was a foreign object in this spacetime and was not something that was derived from the inside of this spacetime, if the spacetime itself did not repel such a foreign object, the repulsive force naturally would not have been produced. The third was the sense of existence that Luo Fan naturally emitted after entering this spacetime. Even with the first two conditions, if this sense of existence did not emit, then the spacetime naturally would not have been able to discover that Luo Fan had already entered. If it did not even discover him, there would naturally not be a repulsive force acting on Luo Fan. Obviously, with Luo Fan's ability, it was either that he was unwilling or that he couldn't eliminate the first and second conditions. Needless to say, how could Luo Fan eliminate himself to eliminate this repulsive force? If he did not exist, what was the use of eliminating this repulsive force? Needless to say, the second condition was even more obvious. If he could easily eliminate this spacetime, why would he enter this spacetime now? Why would he care about this repulsive force? Therefore, his erasure could only be targeted at the third condition. Fortunately, ever since he comprehended the means of combining dimensions and planes, Luo Fan's god art had been greatly enhanced. Previously, he needed to spend a lot of effort and methods to eliminate the sense of existence that he emitted. But now it was as easy as lifting a hand for him. That was why he was able to get rid of the repulsive force that targeted him so easily earlier. As the repulsive force was eliminated, his sense of existence in this spacetime was equivalent to not existing at all. If the world creators around him were real world creators, and not just some marks and phenomena, then his actions would definitely have been discovered. After all, he only eliminated the sense of existence that he emitted and did not completely hide himself. Although they could not sense him with their spiritual senses, they could still see him with their eyes. However, it was a pity that the world creators around them were only a phenomenon. Although they looked like real living beings, everything was just the appearance of that phenomenon. All of their actions and even all of their interactions were clearly the result of the natural operation of the laws of this spacetime. Under such circumstances, their eyes, ears, noses, and all other sensory organs were actually just decorations. In this way, they could discover anything that could be discovered by this spacetime, no matter how hidden it was. And for things that could not be discovered by this spacetime, no matter how obvious it was, they would still turn a blind eye to it. Just like Luo Fan, who was in front of them right now. Even though he was so obvious in front of the world creators, even though there were a few world creators staring at him with lifeless eyes, they still did not react to his existence at all. From the looks of it, it was as if Luo Fan was just a clump of air here. After eliminating the repulsive effect of this spacetime, Luo Fan did not show any joy. After clashing with the invisible palm, he had a deep understanding of this spacetime. This situation couldn't be any more normal to him, and it was not worth being excited about. What's the use of gathering these things? Luo Fan looked at the figures of the world creators that were constantly fluctuating in this spacetime and had this doubt in his heart. Although the invisible palm from before was extremely powerful, it was essentially similar to a clone of the world's will. Compared to Luo Fan, he only needed to resist the sudden attack at the beginning, and there was nothing else after that. He believed that the world's will was aware of this. Since the world's will knew this, why did it still create this spacetime and gather such a degree of power? Was it purely here to deliver food to him? Chapter 29:14. The appearance of these figures was not the same as the appearance of living beings, or rather, the creation of living beings. No matter what kind of living being it was, the essence of life should appear first before everything else would appear. Even if it seemed to be a structure from the outside to the inside, the true order of appearance would be when the essence of life appeared first, before everything else would be constructed on the foundation of the essence of life, such as spirits, minds, spacetime, flesh and blood, and so on. But at this moment, the situation was completely different with the appearance of the world's creator. The situation of the creator of this world was completely constructed out of thin air. It was constructed out of thin air, from the image of this figure itself. This method of construction did not have any signs of the existence of the essence of life. Although the internal details were incomparably complicated and mysterious, everything that belonged to life was only left with an external image. It could be said that if it was not for the appearance of the creator, no one would believe that it was a living being just by looking at its internal structure. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception cut into the interior of the creator's figure, constantly wandering along every detail of its construction, clearly memorizing every detail in his heart. In the blink of an eye, he had completely memorized all the changes of the creator. After that, he did not immediately start analyzing. Instead, he turned around and arrived at another location, paying attention to the process of another creator's figure appearing from nothing. Just like that, in just a few hundred breaths of time, he had already seen every single detail of the tens of thousands of pioneers of this world, and he had deeply memorized all of it. At this point, he turned around and directly appeared at the location where he first appeared in this spacetime. There was nothing special about this place, and even the distribution of the creators was no different from other locations. The reason why he chose this location was not because of the convenience it would bring him. Instead, it was because he was familiar with this location, because this was the place where he had first appeared, because he was familiar with it, and because he had first appeared in this location held a special place in his heart. At the very least, Jia's position was distinguished from the other positions. It was precisely because of this that when he wanted to choose a place to organize his thoughts, he chose this place. After coming to this place and standing still, many details of tens of thousands of world creators appeared in his mind. The way in which each world founder appeared was very different from the way in which other world founders appeared. It wasn't like what most people thought. Because they were of the same nature, they appeared in the same way. In fact, it was precisely because of this huge difference that Luo Fan did not choose the figures of a few founders. Instead, he chose the appearance of tens of thousands of founders as the basis for his deduction. At this moment, these countless details collapsed and directly turned into tens of thousands of rivers that flowed endlessly in his heart. The appearance of these details was extremely subtle and mysterious. The figures of the founders of the world were only a form. Their true core, their true essence, were the various mysterious structures inside. Therefore, if he continued to be limited to this kind of appearance and wanted to understand its essence and what it was, he would obviously be creating artificial obstacles for himself. The most effective method was to break it down and extract the essence contained within it so that the appearance would no longer cause any interference to it. It was precisely because of this thought that he had directly erased the appearance of the many founders of the world. Instead, he reconstructed the many details and transformations, turning them into rivers. Just this slight change in appearance instantly made Luo Fan feel that there was a huge difference. Previously, because of the interference from the appearance of the world founders, the many seemingly different transformation methods did not seem to have anything in common in his eyes at all. It was as if all the transformation methods had no connection at all and were completely independent of each other. However, at this moment, when the external image of the creator of the world disappeared and its essence turned into a common image, the river, the way they appeared that had nothing to do with each other and had nothing in common displayed a shocking commonality. A commonality that was clearly present in the many rivers and seemed to be the true core of the many rivers appeared in the rivers. This description seemed abstract, but if one were to look at it from another perspective, it would be very easy to understand. The surface of the rivers was completely different. It seemed like every river had its own characteristics, and every river had its own trajectory. However, the truth was that there was a tiny trail that belonged to all the rivers in the river. This tiny trajectory was so tiny that it was thousands of times smaller than a strand of hair. When it appeared in the rivers, it seemed even more insignificant and could not affect the trajectory of the entire river at all. Even if a river had this tiny trajectory, it could still change into countless positions and distort into countless shapes. In fact, even if it twisted around, it would not affect this tiny thread at all. Of course, under such circumstances, it would naturally be a fool's dream if it was just one or a few rivers trying to discover this thread. However, it was obvious that there were tens of thousands of rivers in his mind at this moment. Among the tens of thousands of rivers, it was obviously very difficult to find a common thread trajectory. At this moment, under the control of Luo Fan's mind, the tens of thousands of rivers began to slowly overlap in his mind. The illusory images of the rivers continued to overlap towards the center, causing the overlapping images to gradually appear in the middle of the river. In the end, when the tens of thousands of overlapping images appeared, the river that was originally at the center of the core had already expanded into an oval shape. All the overlapping images were very strange. Among the many overlapping images, almost all the strange angles could be distorted. In other words, any place in the area around the river could be crossed by one of the rivers. In this way, after the tens of thousands of rivers appeared, the overlapping images around the rivers naturally became like this at this moment. Of course, although it was almost oval in shape, it was only almost. The edge of the oval was still full of bumps, and there were irregular lines everywhere. At this moment, with just a thought from Luo Fan, the overlapping images began to be continuously shaved off. At this time, what was shaved off was naturally not the overlapping images of the rivers that were previously superimposed. Instead, it was the overlapping images that were too few. If the number of overlapping images was low, it meant that there were fewer rivers that passed through this area. In other words, the possibility of this area belonging to a common trajectory was lower. Along with this change, the oval illusory image began to gradually shrink. Luo Fan continued shaving off the illusory image. At first, he only shaved off the illusory image of a few rivers, or even an area that only one river passed through. However, as time passed, as the process of shaving off the illusory image continued to increase, the number of overlapping rivers also continued to increase. In a short while, almost all the illusory images had been completely shaved off. In the end, the overlapping illusory images of the tens of thousands of rivers were only left with a small, disjointed rule that appeared in his mind. This trajectory was still not perfect. At the very least, its disjointed parts were extremely imperfect. This trajectory was not in the shape of a long strip. Instead, it was a detailed, three-dimensional shape, and its shape gave Luo Fan an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had seen this trajectory somewhere before, but he couldn't recall it no matter how hard he tried. This trajectory was still not the true trajectory. This was because the overlapping areas of the tens of thousands of rivers still did not perfectly outline this trajectory. Some fragments still did not reach the true body of the trajectory. There was still a small area that did not belong to the trajectory that was attached to it. This situation was obviously because there were not enough overlapping rivers. Of course, this was only a small matter. At least at this moment, it was only a small matter in front of the three-dimensional trajectory that Luo Fan found extremely familiar, but he couldn't say why. Why does it feel so familiar? What exactly is it? Luo Fan frowned and carefully observed the trajectory, thinking about what was going on with it. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and sketched in the void in front of him. As he sketched, the surrounding space-time actually began to vibrate subtly. All kinds of fluctuations that were gathering in various parts of the space-time actually began to gather towards him at this moment. Faced with this change, Luo Fan hurriedly stopped his movements. He was not afraid of these fluctuations. These fluctuations were actually nothing to Luo Fan, who had already mastered the combination of dimensions and planes to a rather deep level. If he wanted to, he could easily resist them. However, these fluctuations represented the essence of this space-time, and also represented some kind of tentacle of the will of heaven and earth. If he destroyed these fluctuations, it would be equivalent to announcing to this space-time and the will of heaven and earth that he was here. Come, quickly come and see me. Obviously, if this was what he wanted, Luo Fan would not need to eliminate the sense of existence that his body emitted. Therefore, at this moment, in order to prevent his existence from being discovered by time and space and the will of heaven and earth, he stopped moving. Of course, at this step, although he had stopped moving, he had already clearly recognized the uniqueness of the trajectory in front of him. At the very least, this trajectory had some kind of power that he did not understand. Or rather, he understood it but did not remember it at this moment. What is it? Why does it feel so familiar? This kind of power made Luo Fan want to explore the essence of this trajectory even more. With a slight thought, he spread out his perception and covered a large area. He continuously sensed the figures of the world's founders that were still appearing and being born from nothingness. He constantly sensed them and constantly constructed the entire details of their appearance from nothing in his heart. He then transformed them into the existence of rivers and began to overlap them with the trajectory that he had just excavated from the tens of thousands of worlds' founders. He gradually reduced the size of the trajectory, making the many details of the trajectory more and more specific, and getting closer and closer to the true appearance of the trajectory. Because of his previous experience, this kind of action was carried out extremely smoothly this time. His senses, on the other hand, were able to easily sense the figures of large swathes of the world's founders, constantly memorizing the details of their changes into his own mind. During this process, the number of rivers he constructed increased, and the number of rivers that overlapped with the trajectory also increased. The trajectory was also shrinking bit by bit during this process. Every line was constantly shrinking, and was constantly getting closer to the true essence of the trajectory. This process felt like something was constantly nibbling away at the trajectory, constantly gnawing away at the larger and thicker parts of the trajectory. As time passed, the trajectory continued to shrink. It looked as if it was going to be gradually obliterated. Gradually, it would disappear without a trace. This situation made Luo Fan frown involuntarily. He naturally did not frown because the trajectory was constantly shrinking. This situation was within his expectations. The reason he frowned was because the places where the trajectory was broken were still broken. No matter how many rivers he overlapped on top of it, the parts that were supposed to be disconnected were still disconnected. Furthermore, every single river was able to truly connect these disconnected parts together. Chapter 29:15. With his previous experience, it became easier for him to sense the changes in the figures of the world founders, and it became easier as time passed. In the beginning, he still needed 1 or 2 breaths to complete a cycle of memorizing the changes, but as time passed and he became more familiar with the task, the time began to shrink. Not long after, it had become thousands of cycles in a single breath. In every single round, he would simultaneously sense the changes in the figures of a large number of creators of the world. That way, he would be able to sense the changes of hundreds of thousands or even millions of founders with every breath, turning them into different rivers in his mind, overlapping their trajectories and sculpting them in this way. As time passed, the number of overlaps increased. The trajectories also became smaller and smaller, getting closer to their true appearance. Previously, Luo Fan did not destroy the figures in this spacetime to the extent of destroying all of them. What was destroyed, however, was the figure of the heaven and earth creator was still limited. Even if the number was rather shocking, since it was limited, there would naturally be a time limit for them to recover, no matter how many there were. Finally, at a certain moment not long after, the many fluctuations that vaguely showed a chaotic state in this spacetime suddenly disappeared without a trace. As the fluctuations disappeared, the figures of the world founders that were constantly emerging from the void naturally stopped changing. Originally, a large number of world founders would appear at every moment, but now, not a single world founder was born again. Evidently, this meant that the loss caused by the destruction of the invisible palm had been completely made up for. At this moment, Luo Fan trembled slightly and broke away from the state of constantly memorizing and transforming the information in his memories into rivers, and then overlapping them into the trajectories. Is that all? It's a pity that I can't reach true precision. Luo Fan had an indescribable look of regret on his face. Although he had previously memorized the entire process of the world founders being born from nothingness, there were still hundreds of millions of them. But compared to the trajectories, there were still a lot of them. At this moment, although the trajectories were more than 100 times smaller than before, there were still traces of carving. In the end, it still couldn't reach perfection and completely materialize the trajectories. This was obviously because the number of overlapping rivers was still too small. The trajectories were simply too complicated, and even if a single river could determine a single detail, it would require hundreds of millions of overlapping rivers to determine all the trajectories. Facing such a situation, how could he make the trajectories so precise with just a few rivers? However, it was clear that turning this trajectory into its true form was just a beautiful wish. It was as if infinity was a concept that could only be infinitely approached, but could never be achieved. Therefore, even if he had billions of rivers to calculate, the trajectory that he obtained might still be a little imperfect, and there might even be some imperfections. I can only look at this. At this moment, Luo Fan only focused his gaze on the trajectories. Although the many details of the trajectories had shrunk a lot, in fact, this shrunk had already made the trajectories thousands of times more complicated. This seemed very difficult to understand, but in fact, as long as the trajectories were magnified, they could be clearly seen. It was like a strand of hair and a pillar. If the strand of hair was in the pillar, it would look straight from afar. It would only have the attribute of being cylindrical. However, if this strand of hair was pulled out and allowed to freely change within the huge range of the pillar, how many shapes could this strand of hair change into within this range? Obviously, it was an almost infinite number. And now, the trajectories in Luo Fan's mind were like pillars at the beginning. Although these pillars were extremely small compared to the trajectories, even in Luo Fan's eyes, they were still extremely small lines. But in fact, compared to now, after the changes, the trajectories had become pillars, and the current ones were only strands of hair. Under such circumstances, The many details that were previously covered by the pillars were naturally revealed. And the appearance of these details naturally made the changes of the trajectories more complicated, even hundreds of times more complicated. It was precisely because of this that the entire trajectory was naturally 100 or even 1,000 times more complicated than the original. After becoming more complicated, the sense of familiarity that this trajectory gave Luo Fan had unknowingly increased a lot. I must have seen this trajectory somewhere before. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. The source of that familiar feeling seemed to be right next to his mouth, but he just couldn't say it out loud, and couldn't find the source of that familiarity, no matter how hard he tried. The trajectories that I've come into contact with, the trajectories that are related to the simulated chaotic state, the trajectories related to the tribulations. Luo Fan couldn't figure it out, so he could only use the dumbest method to start comparing the trajectories that he had come into contact with bit by bit. The number of trajectories that he had come into contact with after entering the seventh tribulation was enough to make any cultivator feel incredulous. Even with Luo Fan's thinking ability, the time and energy needed to find and compare them one by one was extremely shocking. At this moment, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan seemed to be in a daze. It actually looked quite similar to the figures of the world creators around him. Of course, it was only a few similarities. After all, he was made of flesh and blood and was a living creature. Of course, he couldn't be exactly the same as this phenomenon. During this process, the sense of existence that his figure emitted was still in a state of non-existence. Clearly, the technique that he had used back then was still effective. It was still protecting him, preventing him from being discovered and rejected by this region of spacetime. Of course, in fact, perhaps this rejection did not have much of an impact on him now. He had roughly obtained what he needed at this moment. At this moment, there was actually nothing wrong with leaving this spacetime, or even leaving this area that was the core of this world. However, if he left, who knew what he would encounter outside and whether there would be a new scheme from the will of the world? In that case, it would be better to stay here. At least, the situation here was something that he was familiar with, and he could deal with it with ease. Obviously, Luo Fan wouldn't choose to give up being able to deal with the attacks and troubles that might erupt at any time and in any way. This process of comparison lasted for a few months. At a certain moment after a few months, an indescribable aura appeared on Luo Fan's body. This aura had even broken through the restrictions of the technique that had completely erased his presence around him, and directly descended into this spacetime. At this moment, this space-time began to tremble. The countless world creators around him couldn't help but turn their gazes towards where Luo Fan was and stared at Luo Fan. It was an extremely strange scene. Immediately afterward, a strong repulsive force began to act on Luo Fan's body. It constantly impacted him and crushed him, as if it wanted to directly crush him and expel him from this place. At this moment, the aura around Luo Fan's body continued to swell and strengthen. Vaguely, there was even a powerful resistance force that appeared around his body. It constantly interacted with the various repulsive forces, producing rumbling sounds and forming circles of ripples that began to spread in all directions. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan gradually returned to his senses. However, compared to before, his face was now filled with shock. It was as if he had suddenly discovered something that completely violated his worldview. It was a fact that he couldn't understand or believe at all. How could this be? How could this be? I should have known this would happen. At this moment, this was the only thought in Luo Fan's mind. This state of mind made his expression filled with shock, and his reaction to all the changes in the outside world became a little sluggish. At this moment, an invisible palm appeared in the sky once again. Furthermore, this time, it wasn't just the palm that appeared. Behind the palm, a huge silhouette started to appear, faintly discernible. The silhouette was so huge that it seemed to fill up the sky and earth. It seemed like even this spacetime couldn't contain its existence, so most of its body seemed to be isolated from this spacetime. Only the palm could enter this spacetime and truly appear within it. At this moment, an unimaginably terrifying aura was continuously released from the silhouette. This aura was so terrifying that it caused the entire spacetime to shake continuously. At this moment, Luo Fan had a feeling that he had been firmly sealed. It was as if the surrounding pressure and repulsive force had turned into ropes, tightly locking down his body, locking down his essence, locking down his karma, and locking down his fate. At this moment, Luo Fan even felt that his main body and his other incarnation seemed to have received some kind of lock and some kind of pressure. It felt as if, in the next instant, this palm would not only destroy his clone, but also his main body, his other clones, and even everything related to him. Everything would be completely destroyed by this palm, and completely destroyed. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he gradually recovered from the shock. If he didn't recover, what awaited him would be death. How could he not recover? At this moment, he looked at the huge palm in front of him, as well as the huge, illusory figure behind the palm that seemed to be outside of time and space, or even outside of the world, unable to enter time and space at all. He had a different feeling in his heart than before. I didn't expect it to be like this. He sighed, raised his hand, and condensed a perception mirror in front of him in an instant. This perception mirror was more than 100 times larger than the one he had condensed before. After it appeared, it had a feeling of covering the sky and the sun. It appeared directly above his head like a rather large island. It also cast a huge shadow on the ground. After this perception mirror appeared, the surrounding spacetime was instantly divided into countless dimensions. At the same time, countless indescribable passageways were established in the various planes, directly connecting with these dimensions. They released unimaginable might and began to pull the attributes of the various planes that the dimensions targeted, spreading them out in all directions. This time, it was clear that it was not only the invisible palm that Luo Fan was targeting that was cut off. This time, it was also targeting the surrounding spacetime, as well as the countless figures of the world's creators. Countless figures in spacetime were instantly divided by the countless dimensions, as if they were divided into countless clones and incarnations. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The surrounding figures were divided, allowing him to clearly see many things that he couldn't see clearly before, allowing him to recognize many things that could only be identified by turning countless details into a river. At the same time, above the invisible palm, there were countless dimensions that were dividing it, causing the invisible palm to rapidly divide at this moment. Countless layers of attributes were wrapped by the countless dimensions and directly appeared in front of Luo Fan, enduring Luo Fan's casual manipulation. Chapter 29:16. The reason why Luo Fan felt that the trajectory was extremely familiar was because the trajectory was the huge rune trajectory that he had drawn with the help of his own perception in the power related to the true divine. That huge three-dimensional rune was extremely mysterious. Even if it was Luo Fan who had drawn it, he was still confused about the rune's trajectory. He had no idea what kind of disparity it had or what kind of mysteries it contained. In fact, even if he wanted to reproduce it in the outside world, he would not be able to do so. It was as if there was a mysterious force that was interfering with him. Even if he wanted to start drawing it, the trajectory would seem vague, and he would not be able to unleash its true power. It was also because of this interference that he would unknowingly ignore the trajectory and throw it to the back of his mind after a long time. It was also because of this nature of the trajectory that Luo Fan could not recognize it after such a long time. He just felt that it was a little familiar. Of course, it was also because the trajectory in front of him was quite broken and was quite different from the trajectory that he had drawn with the power related to the true divine. To be able to use this method to simulate this trajectory, it's definitely not just the incarnation of the will of the tribulation level. This world's will is definitely the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos. Only in this way can it have such a deep control over the countless founders of the universe. After confirming this, Luo Fan also solved a question that had been bothering him for a long time. All along, he had been unable to distinguish whether the world's will was the incarnation of the tribulation level or the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos. After all, to him, be it the incarnation of the tribulation level or the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos, they were both much larger than him. Moreover, they were both enough to do many things that the incarnation of the will had done to him. Therefore, in the face of various encounters and situations, he could only narrow his guesses about the incarnation of the will to one of the two. The will of heaven and earth was usually referred to as the incarnation of the will of calamity or the incarnation of the will of chaos. However, now that he had discovered the trajectory that he was familiar with, he knew that the will of heaven and earth was definitely not the incarnation of the will of the calamity level. That was because it was impossible for the incarnation of the tribulation level's will to have such a deep understanding of the countless founders of the world in the simulated state of chaos. It was impossible for it to extract the essence of the power related to the true divine from the countless founders of the world. Only the will incarnation that simulated the primal chaos state could achieve this. It was like a police officer. He might be able to catch a criminal, but he could never know every detail of the criminal's thoughts. It was impossible to know what the criminal was thinking when he committed the crime. Only the criminal himself, or rather, only an existence that could control the criminal at all times could know all of this. To the creator of heaven and earth, the tribulation level was like a policeman. This policeman might have a good understanding of the criminal, so no matter how the creator of heaven and earth changed, it was impossible for him to escape. No matter how he committed the crime, it was impossible for him to escape the punishment of the policeman. However, it was obvious that the policeman could not know everything, let alone know when the criminal had done something unrelated to the crime. It was different for the incarnation that simulated the primal chaos state. To the simulation of the primal chaos state, any creator of heaven and earth was created by it. All of their activities were carried out inside the creator's body. To the creator of heaven and earth, the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state was like a high and mighty existence that was constantly observing him and controlling him. Such an existence could naturally understand the creator of heaven and earth better than the policeman. It could naturally understand all the details of the creator of heaven and earth, even the details that had nothing to do with the crime. Therefore, after seeing the broken rune trajectory, Luo Fan could already eliminate one of the two options and determine what the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth was. However, even though he knew this, he was still extremely shocked. The body of the creator of heaven and earth contained some subtle traces of the power related to the true divine, and this was something that Luo Fan was very clear about. After all, the power related to the true divine was a product of his seventh major tribulation. In other words, it was a power that his seventh major tribulation had specifically found from somewhere in the primal chaos state to target Luo Fan. Although this power seemed lazy and uninterested in anything, it had even become Luo Fan's umbrella. However, that was because the level of this power itself far surpassed the seventh major tribulation. This was because the power that was related to the true divine had already been tainted with the mysteries of the true divine. This mysteries allowed the power to have great autonomy, and it was even enough to break free from the restrictions of the seventh tribulation. In the end, this resulted in the current situation where the power related to the true divine was clearly targeting Luo Fan, but in the end, it actually became Luo Fan's umbrella. This was obviously a situation that could only occur after the power related to the true divine had completed its task. In the beginning, this power related to the true divine was ultimately meant to test Luo Fan and deal with Luo Fan. Since it had such a purpose, after it entered the seventh major tribulation, the existence that initially controlled the seventh major tribulation would obviously forcibly manipulate it to complete some task. Obviously, the existence that captured it was none other than the true primal chaos state. In the face of the true primal chaos state, even a true divine would have to give it face and act according to its wishes. It was just like the incarnation or projection of the true divine that Luo Fan had encountered in the previous few major tribulations. This power related to the true divine was obviously not comparable to a real true divine. In such a situation, in the face of the primal chaos state, it obviously did not have much ability to resist. Therefore, when it entered the seventh major tribulation for the first time, all its actions would definitely be completed according to the wishes of the primal chaos state. In other words, it would completely carry out all the arrangements for the seventh major tribulation. What was the arrangement for the seventh major tribulation? The creator of this simulated primal chaos state, as well as the endless heaven and earth in this simulated primal chaos state, the endless heaven and earth. All of this obviously involved the power related to the true divine. Otherwise, there was no need for this power related to the true divine to appear in the seventh major tribulation at all. Only by completing the biggest and most fundamental task could the power related to the true divine be freed and be able to leisurely enjoy the various things in the simulated chaotic state. Translator, Zephy Editor, Dio Quinn. Only by completing the biggest and most fundamental task would the power related to the true divine be able to regain its freedom. Therefore, it was obvious that whether it was the simulated primal chaos state itself, the countless heaven and earth creators themselves, or even the heaven and earth created by the countless heaven and earth creators, they obviously contained some kind of trace of the power related to the true divine. These traces were extremely subtle and obscure. Even Luo Fan had never thought that these traces would have any use. Even if he had actually guessed what kind of task this power related to the true divine would appear in his seventh major tribulation, it was still the same. Now, the incarnation of the will in the simulated primal chaos state clearly told him what kind of use this trace had. Now, although the traces in front of him were extremely broken, they already had some charm of the true rune traces. This charm was the root cause of the appearance of the invisible palm. It was also the reason why there were endless figures of the heaven and earth creators in this space-time at this moment. Those figures of the heaven and earth creators were not heaven and earth creators at all. They were clearly the various traces left behind by the power related to the true divine on the bodies of the heaven and earth creators. This kind of trace existed on the bodies of every world creator. However, it was extremely weak and tiny inside the bodies of every world creator. It was precisely because of this that the endless traces of the world's founders were only able to form a broken rune trail that was only 10% of the complete trail. Of course, this trace was not impossible to perfect. The power related to the true divine clearly did not only create the heaven and earth creators and their corresponding heaven and earth. It also created the simulated primal chaos state. Even if it was not a complete simulation of the primal chaos state itself, it was definitely a large part of the simulated primal chaos state. Therefore, in order to find all the traces and gather all the essence and mysteries together, it was obviously not the only way to gather the traces of the heaven and earth creators. In order to make the rune trace complete, it was necessary to collect all the traces of the power related to the true divine that existed in the simulated primal chaos state in order to make it complete. This might be a little presumptuous, but at least for now, in Luo Fan's opinion, this was the most likely possibility. That power that was related to the true divine might have only left a trace of itself in the creation of certain things. The traces left behind for different things might be the same, or they might be different. From this perspective, Even if the creation of the simulated primal chaos state had the participation of the power related to the true divine, it might not be able to leave all its traces in it, and it might not be able to gather the remaining traces into a complete picture of the power related to the true divine. However, this was only the opinion of ordinary people. In Luo Fan's opinion, this possibility was actually quite high. The appearance of the power related to the true divine had already shown its importance to the simulated primal chaos state, or in other words, to Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. If this power that was related to the true divine was dispensable, then it would be strange and unnecessary for it to appear here. Similarly, it was the same for the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state. For the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state, its appearance here in the seventh tribulation also meant that its appearance was extremely necessary. It could be said that it was a necessary and indispensable part of the seventh tribulation. Since that was the case, it also proved that he was also needed in the entire process of the formation of the seventh calamity. Both of them were necessary, which proved that either of them alone could not form the seventh tribulation, nor could they form everything in the simulated primal chaos state. Of course, these were only the two that Luo Fan had discovered so far. Perhaps there were more things behind it, and more factors were necessary and indispensable. However, this did not affect the current deduction. This also proved that the power related to the true divine was not everything for the seventh tribulation and the simulated primal chaos state. It didn't mean that the power and ability of the power related to the true sage wasn't completely superior to the simulated chaotic state. Therefore, if it wanted to construct the simulated primal chaos state and all the existences related to it, it would obviously need to go all out. It would need to activate all of its power and might in order to achieve this. After all, if it did not need to be fully activated, then it would mean that it did not need to go all out to complete all the tasks given by the primal chaos state. Obviously, in that case, why would other existences and other factors need to exist? Therefore, the appearance of this situation meant that the power that was related to a true saint had left all traces in the simulated state of chaos, as well as the many founders of the world and the many heavens and earths. Chapter 29:17. For Luo Fan, even if he knew about it, it would not be of much use. However, for the will of heaven and earth, or in other words, for the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, knowing about it would be of great use. Just like now, he had forcefully refined the traces of the power that was related to the true saint by relying on the countless founders of the universe. In the end, through these traces, he had achieved a preliminary level of simulation of the power that was related to the true saint. It was no wonder that the invisible palm was so powerful that Luo Fan had to rely on the power of many levels to deal with it. This is only a semi-finished product. The real finished product should be the incarnation of the will. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, when he looked at the broken rune again, he suddenly discovered that the gap, or rather, the broken part, was clearly just enough to accommodate a certain vortex. All he needed to do was to slightly transform it. With a slight thought, the rune trajectory began to slowly change shape and squirm. Finally, after some subtle angle adjustments, an invisible vortex appeared directly in the rune's orbit. The shape of the vortex was like a huge eye. At this moment, it appeared in the rune's trajectory, causing the rune's trajectory to become extremely strange. It even made people suspect that the eye inside the rune trajectory was emitting some kind of terrifying strangeness. As expected, it seems that I have to destroy this place as soon as possible. At this moment, Luo Fan had already made up his mind. The broken rune trajectory in front of him could already use some of the mysteries of the power related to the true saint. If it was truly completed, it was self-evident how terrifying it would be. Even though Luo Fan was confident in himself, he did not really think that the actions of the incarnation of the will would not affect him at all at that moment. He made a grabbing motion in the air, and countless shadows were released from the perception mirror. These countless shadows were the appearance of perception mirrors one after another. Every shadow had its own dimension. After being released, it began to spread in all directions, directly covering a wider and wider range of spacetime. Because of the existence of the mirror shadows, these dimensions suddenly became extremely stable, as if a soft mass of matter suddenly had an additional fulcrum. These dimensions constantly divided the figures of the many world founders, causing them to be unknowingly divided into countless layers of attributes by the countless dimensions, which were then absorbed into the countless dimensions. Those perceptive mirrors were clearly not only there to fix those dimensions. Their existence clearly also took on the role of attack. At this moment, the perception mirror shadows constantly released all kinds of indescribable power, sweeping across the dimension that they existed in. If it was in the complete reality, it would obviously be extremely difficult to erase the figures of the world founders. Although it was not impossible, he could only get rid of a few figures of the world's founders each time. Moreover, the time required for each trip was definitely not short. However, at this moment, through the countless dimensions, the various layers of attributes were extracted from the figures of the complete world founders. The effects of the various layers of attributes complementing each other, supporting each other, and protecting each other naturally disappeared without a trace. Although not all the layers of attributes became extremely weak, because of this, in the countless dimensions, it was impossible for all the layers of attributes to be tough and powerful. Among them, there would definitely be some that were weak and fragile, and these weak and frail ones were obviously where their weaknesses lay. Under the attack of the perception mirror shadows, one could imagine how they performed. In just the blink of an eye, the figures of the world founders within a certain range of Luo Fan's body had already continuously collapsed and died. This kind of collapse and death continued to expand along with the expansion of those dimensions. 1 light year, 2 light years, 3 light years, 10 light years, 100 light years in just a few dozen breaths. The expansion of the dimension had already reached the point of tens of thousands of light years. All the figures of the world founders within these tens of thousands of light years were constantly destroyed and dying under the attacks of the perception mirror shadows and the various dimensions. It seemed like the expansion of this dimension had an incredible ability. Once swept by these dimensions, all the figures of the world founders would instantly collapse, like a strange body formed by the accumulation of sand. As expected, I've been discovered by you. At this moment, a sigh came from the void. Following that, a vortex began to appear in the void out of nowhere, covering the entire spacetime. Under the reflection of this huge vortex, the dimensions that Luo Fan had expanded to encompass tens of thousands of light years seemed so small, like insignificant dots on the vortex. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned. But the current situation was a little terrible. Although it was still the incarnation of the world's will that had appeared in this spacetime, this incarnation was much stronger than any incarnation of the world's will that he had seen before. Moreover, it was not just 1 or 2 times stronger, but thousands or even tens of millions of times stronger. At this moment, he directly changed the direction in which the countless dimensions he had released were spreading. They turned in all directions and turned upwards towards the huge vortex. In the blink of an eye, countless shards smashed into the vortex and began to divide it. Unfortunately, this dividing effect caused the vortex to produce circles after circles of ripples and even made it seem like it was at the critical point of division, as if it would be completely divided in the next moment. All the layers of attributes within seemed to be extracted from the complete vortex, or rather, the complete incarnation of the world's will. However, in the end, this development still came to this. In other words, it stopped at the continuous appearance of the vortex, continuous interweaving, continuous collision, and continuous tearing and crushing each other. In the end, the vortex was not completely divided in the end. This situation was naturally not because the level of the vortex itself had exceeded the scope that Luo Fan could divide. Obviously, this was close to impossible. This was because the source of the power that Luo Fan used to construct the division of the dimensions was not himself. He was merely acting as a channel. It was the many planes that were truly supporting the division of these dimensions. Many layers, apart from the real world. Anything, as long as it did not surpass these many levels, could not resist this kind of division. Even if it could not be done for the time being, it was only because the number of layers participating in the division was not enough. Obviously, although the vortex in front of him was the incarnation of the world's will and was also the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, it was ultimately still limited by the nature of this calamity. It was impossible for it to surpass the layers and ignore the power of the layers. In this case, the division of the dimensions would naturally still be effective against it. In other words, under normal circumstances, the vortex would be divided when it encountered the division of the dimensions. As long as Luo Fan was willing to continue to exert force, he would definitely be able to do it. However, the situation was obviously not like this. No matter how much force Luo Fan exerted, how much he increased the layers he could communicate with, and how hard he tried to combine more layers with these dimensions so that more layers could become the source of the power of the division of the dimensions, he could not further expand the scope of the division of the dimensions. He was also unable to further divide the attributes of the countless layers of the vortex. The reason for this was actually because the volume of the vortex was too huge. All along, Luo Fan had not been too concerned about the volume of things. After all, no matter how big the volume was, as long as the quality did not increase, it was just a bigger pig. As long as the quality was high enough, even if the volume was countless times smaller than the pig, it could definitely be destroyed easily. However, after encountering the world's will this time, he understood that he might have been wrong. After the volume increased to a certain extent, it could actually really ignore the difference in quality. In terms of quality, the division of the dimensions that he was using was definitely much higher than the quality of the world's will. At the very least, at this moment, if the incarnation of the world's will was only at the level that it had appeared in front of him in the past, he would not even need to exert more force and let more layers participate in the division of the dimensions. Just the original division of the dimensions would be enough to completely eliminate the world's will. However, at this moment, no matter how much force he exerted, no matter how much he pushed the division of the dimensions, the incarnation of the world's will almost completely ignored it. No matter how many layers of attributes the world's will was divided into within the coverage of the dimensions, the surrounding world's will would be able to pour in at the same time and instantly make up for everything that was lost. Once, twice, 100 times, 200 times, 100 million times, 200 million times, no matter how many times it was, no matter how unbelievable the number was, as long as the division appeared, the surrounding compensations and replenishments would appear at the same time, rendering the division of the world's will useless. If this incarnation of the world's will could remain motionless and wait for Luo Fan to divide it, perhaps after hundreds of millions of years or even billions of years, this division could completely divide this incarnation of the world's will. However, for the time being, any division of the world's will would be useless if it was less than this period of time. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly and turn his head to look at the actions of the world's will outside. At this moment, after the world's will covered the entire space-time, it began to frantically absorb the endless figures of the world's founders below. At the same time, circles after circles of the world's founders appeared in the void. They were the figures of the world's founders that Luo Fan had destroyed with the division of the dimensions. Evidently, the incarnation of the world's will was not only trying to fuse the surviving world's founders into itself, but it was also trying to fuse even more world's founders into itself. This situation made Luo Fan's eyebrows deeply wrinkle. Looks like it's not going to hold back anymore. From a certain point of view, this is a good thing. He could only say this to himself at this moment. The reason why the world's will did not complete the fusion earlier was clearly because it had its own thoughts. Perhaps it was due to some kind of restriction, or perhaps it would have to pay a price, or perhaps it was because the fusion might not reach a perfect state. No matter what, if the world's will had its own thoughts, this was clearly not the time for the fusion. However, at this moment, because of Luo Fan's coercion and because of Luo Fan's actions, the world's will finally had no choice but to change its original plan. It had no choice but to start the fusion at a time when it originally thought it was not the right time for the fusion. This situation was clearly a good thing for Luo Fan. However, he still did not know exactly what was good about it. At this moment, the incarnation of the world's will was fusing the figures of the world's founders at a relatively fast speed. While Luo Fan was pondering, the incarnation of the world's will had already fused most of the world's founders into its body. As the figures of the world's founders continued to fuse, the huge vortex also unknowingly underwent some subtle changes. Vaguely, other colors began to appear on the vortex. This color was extremely familiar to Luo Fan. It was the color of the power related to true saints. It was a color that could not be described at all, and it could not be classified by any color at all. Chapter 29:18. At this moment, Luo Fan couldn't be any clearer about what this luster represented when it appeared on the incarnation of the world's will. It really did obtain some characteristics of that power. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind, and his expression became extremely solemn. As those figures continued to merge into the vortex, the luster that belonged to that power above the vortex became richer and more obvious. A subtle aura that belonged to that power gradually emerged from it, a subtle aura that reigned above everything else. This aura could almost suppress everything. Under this aura, the entire space-time seemed to be unable to bear it, and there was a faint feeling of being overwhelmed. Sensing this aura, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. Although it had some characteristics and charm of the power related to the true sage, it was still far from its true essence. In the end, it was still far from its true essence. The gap between it and that power was still as wide as the distance between the heavens and the earth. The reason for such a judgment was actually very simple, and it was because this space-time was overwhelmed at this moment. Don't forget where that power related to the true sage was now. That power was in the core space-time of the world of laws. No matter how confident Luo Fan was and how much he wanted to flatter himself, he didn't dare say that his world of laws was stronger than the great world formed by the incarnation of the world's will that simulated the state of chaos. He also didn't dare say that the core of his world of laws was stronger than the core space-time of the world in front of him. Since the core space-time of the world of laws wasn't stronger than the core space-time of the world in front of him, it was obvious that the power that could overwhelm the core space-time of the world was also not something that the core space-time of the world in front of him could withstand. However, the power that was related to the true sage now existed in the core space-time of the realm of laws effortlessly, and it did not even bring much pressure to the core space-time of the realm of laws. The space-time in front of him, which was clearly stronger than the core space-time of the world of laws, was actually unable to withstand the aura of the power simulated by the will incarnation in the state of chaos. In such a situation, it was obvious that the simulated power wasn't stronger than the real power. Instead, it was because this power had lost a key characteristic of the real power related to the true divine. That was control. This simulated power was obviously unable to achieve perfect control over its own power. If it could control it, the pressure it exerted on this spacetime wouldn't be as great as it was now. This kind of flaw seemed to be just a small flaw, but in fact, for Luo Fan, it was equivalent to a huge weakness. With this weakness, it was equivalent to having a breakthrough point. The originally powerful opponent would no longer be helpless. Moreover, this was only from the perspective of this weakness. If one were to analyze it further, The existence of this weakness actually meant that this simulation was actually an extremely crude and simple simulation. Perhaps it could have a little of the characteristics of that power, but it definitely couldn't have too much. After all, if there were really many characteristics, how could such absolute control be missed? It couldn't be completely simulated in the first place, and because of the problem of control, the simulated power couldn't concentrate all its power in the desired location. If there was a way to solve this problem, how could the will of the world not solve it? It was precisely because of these considerations that Luo Fan appeared to be a little relieved at this time. While Luo Fan was working hard to study the incarnation of the will of the world was also taking action. It was constantly absorbing those figures and suppressing Luo Fan. The speed at which it absorbed those figures was obviously faster than the speed at which Luo Fan destroyed the vortex. Therefore, it was obvious that if Luo Fan wanted to rely on this destruction to completely destroy the opponent before it could completely simulate that power, his plan had obviously failed. After understanding this, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The countless dimensions that were constantly expanding toward the vortex suddenly changed direction and expanded upward in all directions. At this time, the most important thing was to stop the vortex. There were obviously two options to stop the vortex. The first option was naturally to attack the vortex directly. The second choice was to attack the target that the vortex wanted to target. Based on the previous situation, it was obvious that Luo Fan's current ability was insufficient to attack the vortex. Therefore, the only choice he could make now was the second option, which was to attack the target of the vortex directly. The vortex wanted to absorb the countless figures and rely on the traces left behind by the power related to the true sage contained in the countless figures to trace back to the source and simulate the power related to the true sage. In this process, the vortex itself had to exist, and those figures were also necessary. Since it was impossible to destroy the vortex, of course, he could only destroy those figures. Directly destroying those figures had also proven to be very difficult due to the various previous developments. Therefore, at this time, when Luo Fan was continuously expanding his dimensional division, the focus of his destruction was actually not on those figures. Although those figures along the way were also divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimension and were easily destroyed by the shadow of the perceptual mirror during the process of continuous expansion, the real focus of destruction was this space-time. Yes, it was not any other existence, but the space-time itself, which was the core of this world. As the core of this world, this space-time itself was in an extremely delicate position, and the will of heaven and earth clearly did not use this space-time as a carrier for those countless figures. Therefore, although Luo Fan did not know what was so special about this space-time that could help the other party in recreating that power, he clearly knew that the existence of this space-time had an important role in this process. But he clearly knew that the existence of this space-time must have played an important role in this process. In the beginning, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth clearly did not notice Luo Fan's actions. At first, the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth obviously did not notice Luo Fan's actions. He just secretly looked at Luo Fan's useless work with disdain, but he sped up the process of evolving more figures of the will of the heavens and earth. He then absorbed and swallowed them, advancing the progress of his simulation of the power related to the true divine. However, as time passed, as Luo Fan's destruction of the space-time became stronger, the space-time itself was continuously divided into many dimensions, and then it was slowly erased and obliterated. The incarnation of the will of heaven and earth finally discovered his actions. In an instant, an indescribable anger erupted from the vortex. Under this eruption, the entire space-time began to tremble rapidly, as if the entire space-time was about to collapse. As for the terrifying aura that leaked from the power that was being simulated, it became extremely violent at this moment, as if it wanted to destroy everything in this space-time, including the space-time itself. It seems that the simulation of power is not completely unaffected by it. Luo Fan did not panic at all, and he only made a calm guess. At this moment, the emotions displayed by the will of heaven and earth were 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before. Under normal circumstances, as the will of heaven and earth, even if it discovered his actions, the vortex should be quite calm at this moment. This was not an issue of the cultivation of the will of heaven and earth, but it was determined by the nature of the will of heaven and earth. Although it was only a simulation of the will of heaven and earth at the seventh major tribulation, there was an essential difference between the level of the true will of heaven and earth. However, after all, it was a simulation of the Great Tribulation. Even if there was a difference in essence, the various performances were definitely very similar. Perhaps some more intense stimuli could make the will of heaven and earth lose its composure, but obviously, the destruction that Luo Fan was causing to the core spacetime was obviously not that kind of stimulation. Therefore, at this moment, the behavior of the will of heaven and earth was obviously not what it should be doing. Instead, it was the result of being affected by some external force. That external force was obviously the simulation of the power that was constantly advancing in the vortex at this moment. Obviously, the simulation had an extremely profound impact on the will of heaven and earth, causing it to become more emotional. Of course, this was only the effect that was currently being displayed. Luo Fan believed that the simulation would definitely have more and more serious effects on the will of heaven and earth. "Let me see why you care so much about this spacetime," said Luo Fan immediately. At this moment, he instantly reduced most of the dimensions, leaving only a small number of dimensions that began to spread in all directions at a speed that was thousands of times faster than before. After all, this spacetime was just a spacetime, and it was not an existence that was constantly changing. The nature of spacetime itself was that it tended to be stable. In this case, as long as a method that could work on a small part of the spacetime, it was very likely that it would work on the entire spacetime. Previously, during the period before he was discovered by the will of heaven and earth, the destruction that Luo Fan's dimensional division caused to a part of the spacetime had clearly allowed Luo Fan to determine the weaknesses of the spacetime. He knew which dimensions and which levels could be destroyed as long as they were destroyed. In this way, according to the stable nature of the spacetime, these weaknesses were very likely to be the weaknesses of all areas of the spacetime. Therefore, as long as he maintained the dimensions that targeted these weaknesses, there was a great possibility that he could directly target the weaknesses of all areas of the spacetime. In other words, he was very confident that he could deal with the entire spacetime. As most of the dimensions were reduced, the power of the remaining dimensions was greatly enhanced. It was not Luo Fan's own power that determined the power of these dimensions, but the power that was injected into these dimensions by other levels. Luo Fan's role in this was only as a bridge of communication. In other words, Luo Fan had constructed a channel and poured power from other planes through this channel, entering the dimensions that he had separated, assimilating those dimensions into attributes similar to that plane. Then, he had separated the attributes of something that belonged to the plane in the real world. In this case, it was obvious that if the number of the divided dimensions was reduced, Luo Fan would be able to concentrate more power on the specific channel. In this way, the specific channel would naturally increase in size, and the power that could pass through the channel would naturally increase. Therefore, the final result was that if the number of dimensions was reduced, the power of the remaining dimensions would increase. Originally, the dimensions were targeted at the weaknesses, and now that their power had increased, the speed at which they destroyed the spacetime naturally began to increase by thousands of times. In just a flash, the spacetime that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years completely collapsed due to Luo Fan's destruction. As the scope of the collapse expanded to this extent, an effect finally appeared. The appearance of this effect also made Luo Fan finally understand why the will of the world needed to carry out such a simulation in this spacetime. At this moment, as the spacetime that spanned hundreds of millions of light-years was destroyed, waves of unimaginably terrifying power flowed through these damaged spacetime and towards the main body of that world. In the blink of an eye, the spacetime hole that was originally only a few 100 million light-years had expanded by more than 10 times, becoming a few billion light-years in size. Furthermore, it was still expanding at this point. The broken fragments of spacetime started to pour out of the hole without any reservation. Countless fragments smashed into the world outside, causing the world outside to emit terrifying sounds of being overwhelmed. It was as if the entire world, was gradually being torn apart at this moment. So that's the reason. It seems that I didn't win this time, and he didn't succeed either. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Chapter 29:19. As his many dimensions were annihilated, Luo Fan felt that his clone had instantly fallen into a haze. All of a sudden, he felt as if he had been thrown into a state of chaos from heaven and earth. This haze was extremely mysterious. Compared to the state where he could not feel anything when he was in the simulated state of chaos without the protection of the world, he felt like he was in a completely different extreme now. It seemed like he could feel everything here. Time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, paths, heavenly laws, wills, all living beings, everything appeared in his senses at this moment. Moreover, this wasn't an orderly presentation. Instead, it was all in one go. Everything was poured into his heart without reservation, into his senses. It made him feel like everything in him was about to explode at this moment. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan already had a guess in his heart. At this moment, he had probably already fallen between that great world and the simulated state of chaos. The essence of this great world was actually the tribulation level of the simulated state of chaos. This was because it could almost envelop all the worlds in the simulated state of chaos, including all the creators and even the tribulation level of the simulated state of chaos. That was why this world could reach such a level after it was born, and also why it could withstand the presence of the will embodiment in the simulated state of chaos. The relationship between such a world and the simulated state of chaos was definitely an extremely complicated one. In the eyes of ordinary creators, the two might be the simulated state of chaos that was below the tribulation level, or in other words, below this world. But in fact, the two had an almost overlapping relationship. In other words, the simulated state of chaos and this world could actually be considered as 1 and 2, 2 and 1. Being in this world was actually equivalent to being in the simulated state of chaos. Being in the simulated state of chaos was also equivalent to being in this world. From the perspective of dimensions, the two of them were actually equivalent to being in two different dimensions. It was also because of the relationship between the simulated state of chaos and this world that this world could easily absorb the countless worlds in the simulated state of chaos into this world, and could also easily transfer the countless creators of the worlds into this world. After all, because of the overlapping relationship, one only needed to break the indescribable barrier between the two worlds in order to pull those worlds and creators in. The will embodiment was the will embodiment of the simulated state of chaos, and it was also the world's will of this world. Compared to it, whether it was the simulated state of chaos or this world, they were actually just equivalent to its body. If the two bodies in his control wanted to truly come into contact, he only needed to overcome the psychological barrier, which was an extremely simple matter. After understanding the subtle relationship between the two, there was naturally no need to explain where Luo Fan was. At this moment, he had clearly been forcefully pushed out of the core spacetime by the supreme power that had rushed in from outside the core spacetime, as well as out of that world. However, due to the subtle relationship between that world and the simulated state of chaos, he had yet to truly enter the simulated state of chaos. he was only in a state where he was about to enter. In other words, at this moment, he could actually be considered to be in this world, but also in the simulated state of chaos. Of course, on the other hand, it was completely reasonable to say that he was neither in this world nor in the simulated state of chaos. It was precisely because of this strange state that he was able to sense the state of simulated chaos that was difficult to observe, sense, and clearly perceive. At the same time, he was able to sense everything in this world clearly and understand it in his heart. The two intertwined and created the strange feeling he had at this moment. In this state between the world and the simulated state of chaos, Luo Fan felt that his control over his body had been greatly weakened. This weakening ability had almost reached a point where he could not control himself at all. Fortunately, although his control over his body had been weakened, his perception of the other planes still existed. In the simulated state of chaos, the other planes were also completely mixed together. In other words, in the simulated state of chaos, the boundaries between planes had been completely broken. In that world, the boundaries between planes were extremely clear. Therefore, at this moment, when he sensed the other planes, Luo Fan already knew how he could escape from this predicament. He only needed to head towards the area where the boundaries between planes were extremely clear, and he would be able to escape from this predicament and directly enter that world. Of course, if he wanted to enter the simulated state of chaos, he would naturally need to head towards the area where the boundaries between planes had been completely mixed up. Evidently, for Luo Fan, he was currently not interested in entering the simulated state of chaos. Ever since that great world had been opened and the will incarnation of the simulated state of chaos had entered it, becoming the world's will, the core position of the simulated state of chaos had already been lost. Now, for Luo Fan's seventh great tribulation, the true core had clearly become this great world. At this moment, the simulated state of chaos had instead become the background that supported the existence of this great world, the background that supported the existence of this great tribulation. Faced with this situation, there was no need to say which direction Luo Fan should head in. If it were in the past, it would have been difficult for Luo Fan to head in the direction of order amidst this chaos, even if he had the light of the world. But now, to him, this was only a small matter. The greatest difference was that in the past, Luo Fan could not borrow too much power from other planes in the real world. But now, he could easily borrow the power of hundreds of millions of other levels. Under such circumstances, it was clear that his methods were many times more brilliant than before. Just like at this moment, his perception moved slightly, and the perception mirror appeared above his head. With a slight flash, countless phantoms rushed out from it and directly enveloped Luo Fan. These phantoms were pieces of time and space, or rather, they were dimensions. At this time, these dimensions were like the creation of the world. In this chaotic area, Luo Fan directly opened up a space-time that was enough to accommodate him to do whatever he wanted. Endless power belonging to other planes was continuously injected into these dimensions, continuously separating Luo Fan's various plane attributes. This was also the result of having no other choice. This kind of separation actually did not benefit Luo Fan. This was equivalent to directly exposing the weaknesses that were originally hidden in the layers of defense. Even if Luo Fan could rely on the communication between the various planes to achieve infinite rebirth, as long as one plane of himself still existed, this method was still a suicidal action. However, it was obvious that even though Luo Fan could borrow the power of other planes, he could only borrow it. He couldn't perfectly control the power of those planes. What he meant was that although he could construct these dimensions and use the power that belonged to other planes to forcibly maintain these dimensions and spread the chaos that simulated the state of chaos and intertwined with the world, he was still able to create these dimensions. However, it was impossible for him to get rid of the effects of these powers like how he dealt with other powers. In other words, these powers would still accompany these dimensions and be used on him. The result of this effect was what it was now. The various attributes that Luo Fan possessed in the real world were forcibly separated into the various dimensions. At this moment, if there were other powerhouses who could grasp dimensional division here, Luo Fan wouldn't be completely defenseless against them. However, it would also be a lot more dangerous. After all, it was equivalent to directly using one's own weakness to compete with the other party's weakness. It would naturally be fine if he won, but if he lost, it would be a complete failure. However, this obviously wouldn't happen at this moment. Even the world's will obviously didn't grasp this method of dimensional division. In other words, it couldn't grasp this method of using the power of the planes to divide the dimensions. At this moment, if the world's will directly appeared here to attack him, Luo Fan would almost definitely be the winner. After all, no matter what, Luo Fan was the one who used this method of dimensional division. Although he had many attributes in those dimensions, as the leader, he still had some privileges. These privileges weren't enough for him to crush his invading opponent easily, but they were enough for him to gain a certain advantage in battle. This advantage wasn't too strong for those who mastered dimensional division and could also borrow the power of other planes, but it was enough for the world's will. At this moment, the void around Luo Fan's body expanded infinitely. From the outside, it looked like a gap of 30 feet had opened up around Luo Fan's body. Outside of this gap was an endless amount of gray and hazy existences. Inside, there were countless overlapping shadows, forming a space-time that seemed extremely spacious, but actually had an extremely complicated structure. As this space-time was opened up, Luo Fan instantly came into contact with that side of the world. As mentioned before, the structure between this side of the world and the simulated chaotic state was very subtle and mysterious. In this case, the distance between space-time was naturally completely meaningless to the gap between this side of the world and the chaotic state. At this moment, after Luo Fan opened up his defenses and avoided the erosion of the gap, he naturally overlapped with that side of the world. In this way, if he wanted to enter that side of the world, he only needed to break the barrier between that side of the world and this space-time, or in other words, the countless dimensions. In the past, when that side of the world was still extremely peaceful, this would not be difficult. In fact, as long as Luo Fan willed it, he could easily achieve this. However, the current situation here clearly had nothing to do with peace. At this moment, this area, or rather, the area that Luo Fan came into contact with by relying on dimensional division, was in a state that was not much better than the simulated chaotic state. In it, the gray existence was constantly surging like a dense fog, and incredible power was constantly attacking and stirring within it. The gray existence, which was like a dense fog, was eroding, killing, and supporting each other. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan instantly understood what was going on. The power that was constantly surging was the incarnation of the world's will. In other words, it was transformed from the incarnation of the world's will, which was a power that simulated the power related to true saints. At this moment, the power was clearly trying its best to rush out of the chaos and regain its freedom. However, it was a pity that the gray existence itself was a product of the simulated chaotic state and that space-time. Although both of them belonged to the will of heaven and earth, or rather, the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, it was as if a machine that belonged to the same person had suddenly gone mad. Even the owner of the machine could no longer control the machine. Instead, he had to be wary of the machine turning against him. At this moment, the incarnation of the simulated chaotic state was like an ordinary person, although that space-time and the simulated chaotic state belonged to him. However, when the two became chaotic and mixed with each other to form an extremely strange state, he had obviously completely lost the ability to control them. Chapter 29:20. After all, this was the will incarnation of the world's will. As the world's will, the incarnation naturally had countless conveniences in this world. If an ordinary creator of the world was faced with such a situation, they would have already been waiting for death. However, for the incarnation of the will that had already become a simulation of that power, although the situation was troublesome, it was not fatal. At this moment, the incarnation of the will began to shrink rapidly in the face of the chaos. Originally, the body of the will incarnation was unbelievably huge, and even billions of light-years were insignificant compared to its size. This size had clearly brought it enough convenience in the past, making it impossible for Luo Fan to split it up even if he pushed the dimensional division technique to the limit. However, at this moment, such a huge size had clearly brought him a lot of trouble. The larger the size, the greater the area of contact with the outside world. The outside world was filled with endless chaos, and the entire body was suffering from all sorts of attacks caused by the chaos. Due to this huge size, the number of attacks that the body had to endure also became incomparably huge. Therefore, at this moment, if he wanted to get rid of the influence of the chaos, the first thing he had to do was naturally to shrink his body as much as possible. Once his body shrank, the area of attack would be reduced. The number of attacks would also naturally be reduced. Naturally, it would be much easier to get rid of the attacks. Wanting to shrink his body was naturally an extremely correct idea. However, whether he could do it or not was another matter. In the past, the huge size was the best defensive means of the world's will. However, at a time like this greatest convenience had become the greatest obstacle when he wanted to reduce the size of the building. Billions of light-years were only a small dot compared to this huge size, which was enough to show how exaggerated the original size of the incarnation of the will was. With such an exaggerated size, even if it shrank by billions of light-years in an instant, it would still take an extremely long time. Obviously, given the speed at which the incarnation was shrinking, how could it shrink by billions of light-years in an instant? At this moment, facing such a situation, the will incarnation continued to shrink, and the surrounding chaos continued to destroy it. The huge vortex, or rather the incomparably large amount of power that simulated that power, was continuously collapsing under this kind of destruction. Although this collapse was only on the surface and was nothing compared to its huge size, it still spread throughout the entire vortex. However, this was the collapse of every inch of the entire vortex. Amidst this destruction, the incarnation of the will became more and more irritated. Although it was painful, difficult, and unpredictable under this attack, it could still withstand it for the time being. On the other hand, the outcome of the spacetime that it had high hopes for was not so good. At this moment, the vast and boundless spacetime had completely collapsed. Even the endless figures of the creator of the universe, or rather, the traces left behind by the creator of the universe, which belonged to the power related to the true divine, also completely collapsed along with the collapse of the universe. At this moment, it had completely turned into the extremely chaotic state where the universe and the simulated chaos intersected. Although those traces could be refined and fused by the will of the heavens and earth, allowing it to wield unimaginable power, it might even be able to turn the tables and get rid of Luo Fan. However, all of this was the result of the will of heaven and earth tracing back those traces. However, this did not mean that the marks themselves contained such power. Therefore, even though they would possess unimaginable power after being fused together, these traces were ultimately unable to resist the chaotic process of being assimilated into the end. All the traces were completely gone. Without any echo, they had already disappeared into the endless chaos. Not even the slightest trace could be found. In fact, compared to the pain and destruction suffered by the incarnation of the will, the disappearance of these traces made the will of the heavens and earth feel even more pain, anger, and frustration. Although pain and destruction were unbearable for the will of the heavens and earth, they were just some negative feelings. Ordinary cultivators could suppress these negative feelings, let alone the incarnation of the will that was close to the will of the heavens and earth. On the contrary, the result that it had planned for countless years and put in so much effort was finally destroyed and turned into bubbles. This was the greatest blow to its spirit. This was also the most painful thing for it. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan, who was watching from the sidelines, gradually showed a smile on his face. Although he did not know how much power the incarnation of the will could retain and how much power it could retain in the end, it was at least many times better than the previous worst-case scenario. Luo Fan, who had easily gotten rid of the other party, had the right to be happy. In this chaos, even time had become extremely chaotic. Luo Fan, who had been divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimensional division, could actually be considered to be separated from the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, the flow of time in his own body was naturally equal to that of his main body. Meanwhile, his main body was currently in the power related to the true divine, and the flow of time in his body was just the same as the flow of time in the great heavens and earth. Therefore, at this moment, the flow of time in Luo Fan's incarnation was equal to the flow of time in the great heavens and earth in the outside world. In his senses, only a few breaths had passed. In that chaos, tens of millions of years had already passed. After such a long time, the incarnation of the will had finally shrunk its body to a size that could barely be seen. Its surface area was roughly a few 100 million light-years in radius. This was still extremely vast, and to any ordinary person, it was a vast area that they might not be able to find its edge in 10 lifetimes. However, compared to its original size, it had shrunk by hundreds of millions of times. Moreover, to Luo Fan, such a size was clearly within the scope of the size that he could deal with. At this moment, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes lit up, and his heart was already itching to see if there was a chance to teach the incarnation of the will a lesson. To him, the obstacle that prevented him from dealing with the incarnation of the will and getting rid of it was the size of the incarnation of the will. At this moment, the incarnation of the will had become much stronger due to the compression of its body. However, in the end, the biggest obstacle had been destroyed. In this way, he naturally had the possibility of getting rid of it. At this moment, the color of the power related to the true divine above the vortex had become much fainter. Of course, although the color of the power had become much fainter, the overall color was many times richer. However, the richer color was no longer the color of the power related to the true divine. Instead, it was another color that was equally mysterious, profound, and unbelievable. Clearly, the shrinking of the body did not conform to the mystery of the power related to the true divine. That power was obviously not something that could be approached by shrinking the body and condensing the power. The shrinking of the body and the condensing of the power were indeed beneficial to the enhancement and sublimation of the power of the incarnation of the will. It did indeed make the incarnation more powerful and higher in quality. However, the enhancement of the power and the increase in quality had obviously deviated from the power related to the true divine. Of course, this did not mean that the enhancement and the improvement in quality were in the wrong direction. There was no such thing as a right direction or a wrong direction. At least, that was the case in terms of the power. The power related to the true divine was indeed quite powerful, incredible, and almost omnipotent. However, it did not mean that the power was the truth, the way, or the supreme standard. In reality, this power was at most one of the countless types of power that were related to the true divine. In fact, it might not even be the strongest. It only represented an achievement at a certain stage. Perhaps this stage was an extremely high stage for existences like Luo Fan. It was a stage where one could only see their toenails if they looked up. However, this did not mean that this was the only achievement at that stage. It did not mean that the power at that stage was only the power related to the true divine. The will incarnation in front of him had condensed its own body and condensed its own power. Although it deviated from the power that was related to the true divine, its nature was still extremely high. Compared to that power, the power that the incarnation of the will had condensed was mysterious. At this moment, after shrinking to this size, the will incarnation knew that it had already shrunk to its limit. Next, he might be able to improve a little bit and further condense his body size by a tiny bit and a half. However, it was clear that this would waste far too much time. The amount of energy required was simply too much. Perhaps it would take hundreds of millions of years before it could condense a little. This was clearly an unrealistic choice for the current state of the incarnation of the will. The losses it had suffered from resisting the chaos in the outside world for hundreds of millions of years were many times greater than the benefits it could obtain by condensing a little. Faced with such a situation, there was no need to explain what choice the incarnation of the will would make. At this moment, he released boundless power and directly constructed a space-time around him. It was tightly attached to the surface of the huge vortex. It looked like the vortex was covered with a thin film. After this space-time was formed, it began to receive the impact of the chaos in the outside world on the vortex. Endless impacts poured into the space-time, colliding, twisting, strangling, and destroying it continuously. Although the space-time was constructed with the full power of the will avatar and was even tougher and harder to break than this great world, the space-time couldn't even hold on for a short while under the impact of the chaos. Under the impact, countless cracks appeared at the first moment, and on the second moment, countless fragments began to fall from it, constantly being crushed and integrated into the chaos in the surroundings. It was as if what Luo Fan saw was something that happened not long ago, but to the incarnation of the will, it was already tens of millions of years ago. For the incarnation of the will, this situation was already within his expectations. From the very beginning, he had never thought of using this space-time to completely block the chaos in the surroundings. He had constructed this space-time to block the chaos in the outside world for a little while. As long as he had that little bit of time, he would be able to use all sorts of means to escape from this predicament. Fortunately, his essence had improved a lot, which was why he could construct such a sturdy spacetime. If it wasn't for the sturdy spacetime, he probably wouldn't have been able to see the process of the spacetime cracking and shattering. The spacetime would have been completely obliterated, devoured, and disappeared the moment it appeared. He wouldn't even be able to discover the process of its destruction. At this moment, the incarnation of the will made a prompt decision. Without any hesitation, he had already begun to rely on the obstruction of the spacetime to cross over to the outside world. There was an extremely subtle relationship between spacetime and the world. There were countless spacetimes in the world. In any spacetime, there were either fixed or irregular entrances and exits. This was the fundamental reason why spacetime seemed to have a location. However, this didn't mean that spacetime could only be entered and exited. In fact, the entry and exit points of spacetime were just relatively weaker, easier to break through, and easier to enter. It didn't mean that the relationship between the world and spacetime was the same as the relationship between the world and the territory. Chapter 29-21. It could be said that even the smallest spacetime in the world could connect to any location in the world. At the very least, it could connect to a location without any protection. In other words, theoretically speaking, as long as a spacetime was opened up, even the smallest spacetime could be used to travel to any location in the world it was attached to. It was the same even if it was billions of light years away from the original spacetime. However, it was obvious that this was only in theory. What was possible in theory might not be possible in the real world. It was just like how, in theory, anyone could hit the jackpot, but in reality, most people might not even hit the jackpot once in their lives. It was the same for the communication between spacetime and the world. In theory, even the smallest spacetime could be used to travel to any location in the world. However, theory was only theory after all. The truth was that this kind of communication required a great deal of energy. Moreover, the further the distance, the more energy was consumed. In fact, this kind of consumption was not linear, but a consumption of several times. For example, a location that was billions of light-years away could be reached through the smallest spacetime. However, in order to do this and travel such a long distance with the help of a small spacetime, the energy needed could even make a creator weak for a long time. Normally speaking, in normal spacetime, a creator of the universe would only need a few steps to cross a distance of 100 trillion light-years, and the amount of energy consumed would not even be able to keep up with the recovery speed of the creator. Therefore, even if it was feasible in theory, this kind of method was not practical at all. Normally, ordinary cultivators and creators would not choose this method to travel. After all, it was too uneconomical, not practical, and a waste of energy. Moreover, this was only the consumption of distance. If more factors were added, the consumption of energy would be even greater. For example, if there was a natural moat between the location where one wanted to go and where one was, the consumption of energy would be greatly increased due to the barrier of the moat. In this way, with all kinds of restrictions, it was obviously even more inappropriate to use this method to travel. At this moment, the world's will was using such an inappropriate choice. At this moment, it was forcefully using this spacetime to communicate with the location of the normal world outside, which was separated by the boundless chaos. Just the vastness of the chaos itself was shocking. Even if one were to rely on this spacetime to cross this distance, the amount of energy required was tens of millions of times more than the usual method of traveling. Moreover, this chaos itself was the best method to cut off spacetime. It could be said that it was the most difficult moat to cross in the world. If he wanted to make use of the connection between spacetime and the world to bypass this natural moat, he would need to expend tens of thousands of times more energy than he needed to traverse the distance. If the world's will really chose this method, the consumption of energy would even be enough to destroy and recreate tens of thousands of worlds under normal circumstances. Even for the world's will, this consumption was definitely not the kind of consumption that could be laughed off. However, at this moment, facing this consumption, the world's will made a decision without any hesitation. It activated this mechanism without any hesitation. Endless energy burst out from within and frantically buffed the spacetime. It tried its best to strengthen the connection between this spacetime and this great world, which was so weak that it was almost completely gone, so that it could try its best to sense the normal world and spacetime outside of the chaos. In this process, the consumption of energy was simply like the sky shattering and the heavenly river pouring down, which made even Luo Fan feel a little fearful. This was because even he couldn't bear such consumption, as expected of the incarnation of the will that imitates the state of chaos. Its foundation is really strong. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his heart. Even he would have to peel off a layer of his skin from this consumption. However, for the world's will, it actually didn't show any special reaction after such consumption. It was as if it was as easy as lifting its hand to grab something. The spacetime started to shatter under the impact of the chaos. It was extremely fast, and the entire spacetime was about to collapse. At this moment, the world's will finally finished strengthening the connection. Without any hesitation, it poured endless energy into it. Through the connection, its figure directly crossed the endless distance and obstacles, and directly disappeared from this spacetime. When it reappeared, it was already outside the chaos and directly appeared in the normal world. After he disappeared, this expanse of space finally couldn't endure the pressure from the chaos, and it collapsed under the pressure. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into powder and was devoured by the chaos, vanishing without a trace. At the same time, Luo Fan also disappeared from the chaos. After he reappeared, he directly appeared next to the world's will. Of course, this was from his perspective. From the perspective of the world's will, He was currently separated by an unknown number of dimensions and couldn't be seen or sensed at all. The method that Luo Fan used to escape the chaos was completely different from the world's will. He didn't consume any of his energy. In fact, he didn't even consume much of the energy that he originally needed to use the separation of dimensions to isolate the chaos. The reason for this was because he'd connected himself with the will of the world, and he'd borrowed the pull of the will of the world when it left that expanse of space, or rather, when it left that chaotic area, and at the same time, he'd been pulled out of that chaotic area. In other words, the world's will was the one that truly exerted force in the process. He was just riding on it. It's you. All of a sudden, the world's will roared. Then, endless energy was released from its body, engulfing the surrounding space-time and dimensions as it charged towards Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The many dimensions had already completely separated the energy and turned it into countless layers of attribute. As it was separated, the perception mirror appeared out of nowhere in the countless dimensions. In a flash, it had already completely erased the countless layers of attributes that were attacking him from the dimensions. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face in the face of this situation. With a flash of his separation of dimensions, he had already been released. His various layers of attributes instantly reassembled into his body in the real world. His body and mind also appeared out of nowhere in front of the world's will. After the world's will broke free from the chaos, it could already re-establish contact with its main body. Logically speaking, at this time, he should have completely lost the weakness and exhaustion caused by the consumption of energy. After all, even if the world's will clone was huge, it was still insignificant compared to its main body. With this kind of consumption, even if it was completely exhausted, even if the entire incarnation completely collapsed and bet everything on it, this kind of consumption was insignificant compared to the true body. As long as its main body was willing, it only needed to leak out a little of the endless energy it possessed to make up for the clone's loss. Even though that was the case, the world's will clone still felt inexplicably exhausted. It didn't seem to be condensed at all. Instead, it seemed a little empty and powerless. One must know that the world's will clone had already condensed tens of thousands of times. At this moment, although its body was extremely huge, it had already shrunk by tens of thousands of times compared to its original size. In this way, the nature of its energy and its own characteristics should be tens of thousands of times stronger than before. However, although it was still much stronger than before, it was far from the state it was in when it had just condensed. With a single glance, one could tell that he had yet to recover from the exhaustion he had expended earlier. At this moment, he was still in a state of extreme emptiness, extreme fatigue, and extreme exhaustion. This made Luo Fan ponder a lot for a moment, and he vaguely made some guesses. Of course, he still had to test out this conjecture before he could confirm it. At this moment, with a thought, the dimensional division instantly expanded upward. In the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to the extent that it had completely enveloped the world's will clone. Although the world's will was still extremely huge after being condensed, it had already shrunk to the extent that Luo Fan could deal with it. In this way, his dimensional division had finally completely enveloped the world's will clone. The dimensions kept rushing towards the will incarnation of the world's will, smashing into its body, and causing wave after wave of ripples to appear on its body. Facing the ripples, the world's will started to struggle with all its might. Furious roars came from its body. That kind of performance was not much different from a normal living being. It had completely lost the performance that an ordinary world's will should have. Although the world's will had become many times stronger, and there was even a faint aura of power on its body that had a different flavor compared to that power, the world's will had consumed too much energy. However, at this moment, the consumption was too great, and it was difficult for him to unleash the power of his essence. Under the impact of the countless dimensions, he was slowly being separated by the dimensional segmentation. Gradually, he was divided into layers of attributes and fused with the various dimensions. Even so, the world's will's original body still did not do anything, and the clone still did not ask for help from the world's will. This situation made Luo Fan understand that his previous guess was probably correct. It actually managed to sever the connection with its true body. Is it because of that power? At this moment, he muttered to himself with an indescribable excitement. For the world's will, the most difficult thing to deal with was its size. More specifically, it was the size of its true body. The size of the world will was so large that it had evolved from a quantitative change to a qualitative change. Just by relying on its size, Luo Fan was already at his wits' end. He simply had no way to deal with it. Previously, the reason why he could not deal with the clone of the world's will was because the clone's size was too big, and it was difficult to deal with it. But now, the size of the avatar had already been compressed by itself, and the connection between it and the original body had already been severed. In this way, the biggest problem for Luo Fan had already been solved. In this way, it had become possible for him to deal with the avatar of the will of the heavens and earth, which was originally impossible. How could he not be happy? Perhaps I can obtain another power. Suddenly, another thought appeared in his mind, and he could not help but become even more excited. The world's will originally wanted to evolve the power that was related to true saint. However, due to the various damages, although the power that it evolved in the end had a slight hint of the power that was related to true saints, it had completely changed overall. The current power was actually completely different from that power in essence. However, at the same time, although its essence was different, this power was actually equally powerful, and it was also worth looking forward to. If Luo Fan could master this power, then his strength would definitely increase by a large margin. Perhaps through this power that was different in essence, but at the same level, he could also deepen his understanding of the power that was related to his true body. At the very least, he could deepen his understanding of the world's will through this power. Putting everything else aside, the reason why the clone of the world's will would sever its connection with its original body and abandon its greatest support was a question that was worth researching. Chapter 29-22. The countless dimensions gradually separated the many attributes of the incarnation of the will of the world and assimilated them into the many dimensions. As the incarnation of the will of the world, it was an existence that was similar to the power related to the true divine. Although it was different from the power related to the true divine, its essence was equally brilliant and powerful. This kind of division was naturally not a simple matter. Originally, Luo Fan only needed to construct the method to divide the dimensions and finally activate the division. What supported the division was no longer him, but the many layers. Hence, after that, he actually did not need to use much power at all, nor did he need to push the dimensions to divide them. At the very most, he could only work hard to expand the passageway between the dimensions so that the power of that layer could descend into those dimensions. Now, facing the incarnation of the will of the world that had condensed the strange power of the will of the world, Luo Fan could not be as relaxed as before. Although that power could not be compared to the power related to the true divine, it was still of an extremely high level and contained all sorts of unimaginable power. At this moment, even if the attributes that had been divided into countless layers were assimilated into the many dimensions, that power still had some special characteristics. When it was brought into the many dimensions, it still firmly protected the attributes of those layers. Under such circumstances, the incarnation of the will, which was originally purely the attributes of those layers, had already been surrounded by layers of illusory figures that wrapped around those attributes. These illusory figures were extremely mysterious and wonderful. They seemed to be the attributes of those layers, but they also seemed to have transcended those attributes and were very different from them. The existence of this kind of phantom made it impossible for Luo Fan to deal with it as he did with other target. After the dimensional division took effect, it would be easy for him to get rid of it. At this moment, the illusory figures of countless perceptive mirrors continuously swayed among the dimensions, and all sorts of attacks aimed at the attributes of the evil layer continuously surged towards the attributes of those layers. However, in the end, most of the attacks in the dimensions turned into bubbles. They did not even have the ability to shake the illusory figures around the attributes of those layers, let alone break through the illusory figures to harm the attributes of those layers. Only in an extremely small number of dimensions could the targeted attacks released by the illusory figures of the perceptive mirrors hurt those illusory figures and cause some damage to them. However, that was all there was to it. Although some damage could be seen, it was only damage. If one wanted to truly break through its defenses, and come into contact with the attributes that were wrapped within the illusory figure, it was impossible to even think about it. This situation made Luo Fan's expression turn grave. At this moment, he could only do his best to strengthen his own perceptual mirror and integrate more layers of mysteries into it. This allowed the power of the many layers to fuse even more closely and become even more exquisite. Through this method, he tried his best to strengthen the effect of the perceptual mirror phantoms in the various dimensions, making the perceptual mirror phantoms more powerful against the target. He tried his best to break through the defense of the phantoms around the phantoms and injure the internal attribute. This was not a simple matter. Even with Luo Fan's comprehension and understanding of those layers, it would not be easy for him to achieve this. At this moment, he fully activated his thoughts, and the connection between his body and the various layers became even stronger. Endless power was continuously absorbed into the perceptive mirrors from other layers, and then transferred into the illusory figures of the many perceptive mirrors through the perceptive mirrors and into the various dimensions. Following this process, one shadow after another gradually appeared on his body. Faintly, it seemed as if even his body was about to be divided into countless dimensions. At this moment, there was a faint rumble of thunder in the void. There seemed to be a line of sight coming from above. This line of sight was filled with powerful oppression. Even Luo Fan could feel an indescribable pressure emerging from his heart when he was stared at by this line of sight. At this moment, he knew that this line of sight definitely existed, and it definitely seemed to come from the main body of the world's will. Sensing this line of sight, his expression relaxed slightly. This kind of situation had once again proved his previous guess. The connection between the incarnation of the world's will and the main body had been completely severed. Now, even if the main body had already discovered the changes here and discovered that the incarnation was being attacked by him, it could not come to support him at this moment. At the very least, it could not directly send support to the incarnation. This situation was obviously a good thing for him. At the very least, the target he needed to face now was the rather difficult incarnation of the world's will, and not the main body of the world's will. At this moment, under Luo Fan's efforts, the attacks released by the illusory figures of the perceptive mirrors in the various dimensions began to undergo various changes. Originally, it was just a simple charge and suppression, but it gradually turned into all kinds of strange attacks. Some were shining, some were changing rules, some were changing nomological laws, and some were even battle techniques such as blade techniques and sword technique. In some dimensions, those attacks even turned into various magic treasures with different functions. All kinds of strange attacks condensed almost all the attack methods that Luo Fan knew. He used all kinds of strange angles to probe the illusory figures in the various dimensions, trying to break through the illusory figures' defenses and destroy the internal attributes of the illusory figures. Although the effects were not obvious for the time being, it was clear that the incarnation of the world's will was rather helpless against his methods. Although the illusory figures could still firmly protect many of the internal attributes in the various dimensions for the time being, even the illusory figures who performed poorly were only shaken, and the internal attributes were not really damaged. However, this was obviously only temporary. Even if it was a fight between two ordinary people, a powerhouse who was slow to react would definitely lose to the more agile person's attack, let alone an existence at Luo Fan's level. To Luo Fan, his opponent's slow reaction and powerlessness were like a dead object waiting for him to study, think of, or even create a way to attack his opponent. If he still could not defeat his opponent in this way, he would not have cultivated to this level. At this moment, faced with such an incarnation of the world's will, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He continuously probed the illusory figure's properties in the various dimensions. The results of these tests were continuously transmitted to his heart, and he gradually integrated them. In just a short span of a few dozen breaths, the properties of the illusory figure had already formed a complete table in his mind. Although the table was extremely vast and long, it was extremely shocking. If it was an ordinary person, they would probably need to spend thousands or even tens of thousands of years just to finish looking through it. However, since all the properties had been listed in a table, the illusory figure naturally no longer had any secrets to Luo Fan. Since there were no more secrets, his weakness was naturally exposed. Immediately, as thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, endless information flashed through his mind. In the end, he had already come up with several dozen ways to deal with the illusory figure in the various dimensions. Among those methods, he could find as many as 3 methods that were convenient to use and had the strongest effects. Let's see what other trump cards you have. At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he felt an urge to give it a try. With this urge, he began to take action. He chose the first method, which was also the simplest method to execute. At this moment, indescribable rays of light erupted from the many dimensions and from the illusory figure in his perception mirror. After these rays of light erupted, they began to evolve naturally and eventually turned into human figures. Each of them looked exactly like Luo Fan, but their insides seemed to be filled with infinite laws and principles, infinite concepts, and even a worldview of the laws. After these figures appeared, it was as if the core of the dimension had descended out of thin air. There was a charm of suppressing the heavens and completely controlling the universe. Immediately after, these figures brazenly rushed towards the various layers of attributes of the will incarnation of the world's will. At this moment, the illusory figures in the various dimensions reacted at the same time. Of course, the reactions of the many illusory figures were naturally different due to the different environment. Some of the phantoms directly pounced towards the phantoms that had a similar appearance to Luo Fan, wanting to directly shatter it with their powerful strength. Some of them transformed into another form and derived the void, wanting to protect themselves and isolate the phantoms that had a similar appearance to Luo Fan. Some transformed into existences like weapons that drowned out Luo Fan's figure. There were all kinds of them, and they seemed to have exhausted all forms of attacks that could exist in the universe. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan's figure also appeared extremely calm. Before the attack arrived, he easily performed all kinds of methods and forcibly wiped out the numerous attacks. His figure brazenly crashed into the illusory figure, blocking the illusory figure while continuously approaching the core of the illusory figure. Those illusory figures were protecting the level attributes of the will incarnation of the world's will. Or rather, it was the level attributes that belonged to that power. At this moment, the figures of Luo Fan that appeared in those dimensions were existences derived from Luo Fan's worldview, which was a combination of many concepts and the power of the dimensions. This existence seemed like a human figure, but it was actually a world of laws that had been materialized according to the level, or rather, it was just like the level attributes of the world of laws, Although it had already been condensed and was very different from the original level attributes of the world of laws, it still contained some characteristics of the world of laws. At this moment, the countless illusory figures drowned out the figure. In fact, it was equivalent to those illusory figures attacking the world of laws. A world of laws naturally couldn't be annihilated so easily. Even at this moment, the level displayed by those illusory figures was extremely high, and the power they displayed was extremely terrifying. Even in those many dimensions, they could still ignore the nature of the dimension itself and exert some of the power of the complete power. However, they were still existences in different dimensions and hadn't undergone dimensional materialization. It could be said that they were still somewhat unacclimatized to the various dimensions. This sort of unacclimatization naturally wasn't a big deal in the past. After all, even the attacks of the perceptual mirrors of Luo Fan didn't belong to those levels, or rather, those dimensional technique. In a way, the degree of materialization was also insufficient. However, things were different now for the Luo Fan. The Luo Fan in those dimensions was completely a world of laws that had been materialized according to those dimensions. Although it was only a temporary existence that couldn't last long, and it was impossible for it to truly continue to evolve, the world of laws was still a world of laws. However, the world of laws was the world of laws. Its might, power, worldview, and uniqueness were all unquestionable. The world of laws that had been materialized according to those dimensions was like a fish in water, and it could receive the endless blessings of those dimensions. In this way, if they wanted to destroy the Luo Fan, they would have to break those dimensions first. Otherwise, no matter how many of these Luo Fans were destroyed and how serious their injuries were, they could easily recover through the replenishment of those dimensions. Under such circumstances, how could those illusory figures easily annihilate the Luo Fan? In the end, when the Luo Fan passed through the protection of those illusory figures and appeared in front of those dimensions, the illusory figures only managed to annihilate more than half of the Luo Fan's bodies. Moreover, not all the illusory figures in the dimensions could do this. In the vast majority of the dimensions, the illusory figures could only leave some traces on the bodies of the Luo Fan. I finally succeeded. At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face.